it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome back to the Quiet Hour, where the past still breathes and old fears refuse to stay buried. As always, I'll be your companion this Christmas night as we step away from the modern world and into a darker age, one lit by gas lamps, candle flame, and the creeping certainty that something is watching from just beyond the page. So draw closer, let the night settle around you, and allow the present to fade. Tonight's stories come from another time when horror was slow, deliberate, and impossibly intimate. Tales that have survived because they still know how to crawl under your skin. If you're ready to hear what once kept our ancestors awake in the dark, then let us begin. The Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson. It was a dark, starless night. We were becalmed in the northern Pacific. Our exact position I did not know, for the sun had been hidden during the course of a weary, breathless week by a thin haze which had seemed to float above us, about the height of our mastheads, at whiles descending and shrouding the surrounding sea. With there being no wind, we'd steadied the tiller, and I was the only man on deck. The crew, consisting of 2 men and a boy, were sleeping forward in their den, while Will, my friend and the master of our little craft, was aft in his bunk on the port side of the little cabin. Suddenly, from out of the surrounding darkness, there came a hail. "Schooner, ahoy!" The cry was so unexpected that I gave no immediate answer because of my surprise. It came again, a voice curiously throaty and inhuman, calling from somewhere upon the dark sea away on our port broadside. "Schooner, ahoy!" "Hello," I sung out, having gathered my wits somewhat. "What are you? What do you want?" "Oh, you need not be afraid," answered the queer voice, having probably noticed some trace of confusion in my tone. "I am only an old, man." The pause sounded odd, but it was only afterward that it came back to me with any significance. "Oh, why don't you come alongside then?" I queried somewhat snappishly, for I liked not his hinting at my having been a trifle shaken. I can't. It wouldn't be safe. The voice broke off, and then there was silence. "What do you mean?" I asked, growing more and more astonished. "What's not safe? Where are you?" I listened for a moment, but there came no answer, and then a sudden indefinite suspicion of I knew not what coming to me, I stepped swiftly to the binnacle and took out the lighted lamp. At the same time I knocked on the deck with my heel to waken Will. Then I was back at the side, throwing the yellow funnel of light out into the silent immensity beyond our rail. As I did so, I heard a slight muffled cry, and then the sound of a splash, as though someone had dipped oars abruptly. Yet I cannot say with certainty that I saw anything, save it seemed to me that with the first flash of the light there had been something upon the waters, where now there was nothing. "Hello there," I called. "What foolery is this?" But there came only the indistinct sounds of a boat being pulled away into the night. Then I heard Will's voice from the direction of the after scuttle. "What's up, George?" "Come here, Will," I said. "What is it?" he asked, coming across the deck. I told him the queer thing that had happened. He put several questions, and then, after a moment's silence, he raised his hands to his lips and hailed, "Boat, ahoy!" From a long distance away there came back to us a faint reply, and my companion repeated his call. Presently, after a short period of silence, there grew on our hearing the muffled sound of oars, at which Will hailed again. This time there was a reply. "Put away the light." "Damned if I will," I muttered, but Will told me to do as the voice bade, and I shoved it down under the bulwarks. "Come nearer," he said, and the oar strokes continued. Then, when apparently some half-dozen fathoms distance, they again ceased. "Come alongside," exclaimed Will. "There's nothing to be frightened of aboard here." "Promise that you will not show the light." "What's to do with you?" I burst out, "that you're so infernally afraid of the light?" "Because," began the voice, and stopped short. "Because what?" I asked quickly. Will put his hand on my shoulder. "Shut up a minute, old man," he said in a low voice. "Let me tackle him." He leaned more over the rail. "See here, mister," he said. "This is a pretty queer business, and you coming upon us like this, right out in the middle of the blessed Pacific. How are we to know what sort of a hanky-panky trick you're up to? You say there's only one of you. How are we to know unless we get a squint of you, eh? What's your objection to the light, anyway?" As he finished, I heard the noise of the oars again, and then the voice came, but now from a greater distance, and sounding extremely hopeless and pathetic. I'm sorry, I would not have troubled you, only I'm hungry, and so is she." The voice died away, and the sound of the oars, dipping irregularly, was borne to us. "Stop!" sang out Will. "I don't want to drive you away. Come back. We'll keep the light hidden if you don't like it." He turned to me. "It's a damn queer rig, this, but I think there's nothing to be afraid of." There was a question in his tone, and I replied, "No, I think the poor devil's been wrecked around here and gone crazy." The sound of the oars drew nearer. "Shove that lamp back in the binnacle," said Will. Then he leaned over the rail and listened. I replaced the lamp and came back to his side. The dipping of the oars ceased some dozen yards distant. "Won't you come alongside now?" asked Will in an even voice. "I've had the lamp put back in the binnacle." I cannot," replied the voice. "I dare not come nearer. I dare not even pay you for the provisions." "That's all right," said Will, and hesitated. "You're welcome to as much grub as you can take." Again he hesitated. "Oh, you are very good," exclaimed the voice. "May God, who understands everything, reward you." It broke off huskily. The lady," said Will abruptly. "Is she here?" "Oh, I have left her behind upon the island," came the voice. "What island?" I cut in. "Oh, I know not its name," returned the voice. "I would to God—" it began, and then checked itself just as suddenly. "Oh, could we not send a boat for her?" asked Will at this point. "No," said the voice, with extraordinary emphasis. "My God, no." There was a moment's pause. Then it added in a tone which seemed a merited reproach. "Oh, it was because of our want I ventured, because her agony tortured me." "Oh, I am a forgetful brute," exclaimed Will. "Just wait a minute, whoever you are, and I will bring you up something at once." In a couple of minutes he was back again, and his arms were full of various edibles. He paused at the rail. "Can't you come alongside for them?" he asked. "No, I dare not," replied the voice, and it seemed to me that in its tones I detected a note of stifled craving, as though the owner hushed a mortal desire. It came to me then in a flash that the poor old creature out there in the darkness was suffering for actual need for that which Will held in his arms, and yet, because of some unintelligible dread, refraining from dashing to the side of our schooner and receiving it. And with the lightning-like conviction, there came the knowledge that the invisible was not mad, but sanely facing some intolerable horror. "Damn it, Will," I said, full of many feelings over which predominated a vast sympathy. "Get a box. We must float off some stuff to him in it." This we did, propelling it away from the vessel, out into the darkness by means of a boat hook. In a minute a slight cry from the invisible came to us, and we knew that he'd secured the box. A little later he called out a farewell to us, and so heartful a blessing that I'm sure we were the better for it. And then, without more ado, we heard the ply of oars across the darkness. "Pretty soon off," remarked Will, with perhaps just a little sense of injury. "Wait," I replied. "I think somehow he'll come back. He must have been badly needing that food." "And the lady?" said Will. For a moment he was silent, and then he continued. "It's the queerest thing I've tumbled across since I've been fishing." "Yes," I said, and fell to pondering. And so the time slipped away. An hour, another, and still Will stayed with me. For the queer adventure had knocked all desire for sleep out of him. The third hour was 3 parts through when we heard again the sound of oars across the silent ocean. "Listen," said Will, a low note of excitement in his voice. "He's coming, just as I thought," I muttered. The dipping of the oars drew nearer, and I noticed that the strokes were firmer and longer. The food had been needed. They came to a stop a little distance off the broadside, and the queer voice came again to us through the darkness. "Schooner, ahoy!" "That you?" asked Will. "Yes," replied the voice. "I left you suddenly, but there was a great need." "The lady?" questioned Will. "The lady is grateful now on earth. She'll be more grateful soon, in heaven." Will began to make some reply in a puzzled voice, but became confused and broke off short. I said nothing. I was wondering at the curious pauses, and apart from my wonder, I was full of a great sympathy. The voice continued. She and I have talked, as we shared the result of God's tenderness and yours." Will interposed, but without great coherence. "I beg of you not to belittle your deed of Christian charity this night," said the voice. "Be sure that it has not escaped his notice." It stopped, and then there was a full minute's silence. Then it came again. "We have spoken together about this, which has befallen us. We had thought to go out without telling anyone of the terror which has come into our lives. She's with me in believing that tonight's happenings are under a special ruling, and that it's God's wish that we should tell you all that we have suffered since... "Yes," said Will softly. "Since the sinking of the Albatross." "Ah!" I exclaimed involuntarily. "She left Newcastle for Frisco some 6 months ago, and hasn't been heard of since." "Yes," said the voice, "but some few degrees to the north of the line. She was caught in a terrible storm and dismasted. When the day came, it was found she was leaking badly, and presently, it falling into a calm, the sailors took to the boats, leaving a young lady, my fiancée, and myself upon the wreck. We were below, gathering together a few of our belongings when they left. They were entirely callous, through fear, and when we came upon the decks, we saw them only as small shapes afar off upon the horizon. Yet we did not despair, but set to work and constructed a small raft. Upon this we put such few matters as it would hold, including a quantity of water and some ship's biscuit. Then, the vessel being very deep in the water, we got ourselves onto the raft and pushed off. It was later when I observed that we seemed to be in the way of some tide or current which bore us from the ship at an angle, so that in the course of 3 hours, by my watch, her hull became invisible to our sight, her broken mast remaining in view for a somewhat longer period. Then, towards evening, it grew misty, and so through the night. The next day we were still encompassed by the mist, the weather remaining quiet. For 4 days we drifted through this strange haze until, on the evening of the 4th day, there grew upon our ears the murmur of breakers at a distance. Gradually it became plainer, and somewhat after midnight it appeared to sound upon either hand at no very great space. The raft was raised upon a swell several times. Then we were in smooth water, and the noise of the breakers was behind. When the morning came, we found that we were in a sort of great lagoon, but of this we noticed little at the time, for close before us, through the enshrouding mist, loomed the hull of a large sailing vessel. With one accord we fell upon our knees and thanked God, for we thought that here was an end to our perils. How much we had to learn. The raft drew near to the ship, and we shouted on them to take us aboard, but none answered. Presently the raft touched against the side of the vessel, and seeing a rope hanging downward, I seized it and began to climb. Yet I had much ado to make my way up, because of a kind of grey, lichenous fungus that seized upon the rope, which blotched the side of the ship lividly. I reached the rail and clambered over it onto the deck. Here I saw that the decks were covered in great patches with grey masses, some of them rising into nodules several feet in height. But at the time I thought less of this matter than of the possibility of there being people aboard the ship. I shouted, but none answered. Then I went to the door below the poop deck. I opened it and peered in. There was a great smell of staleness, so I knew in one moment that nothing living was within, and with that knowledge I shut the door quickly, for I felt suddenly lonely. I went back to the side where I'd scrambled up. My sweetheart was still sitting quietly upon the raft. Well, seeing me look down, she called up to know whether there were any aboard of the ship. I replied that the vessel had the appearance of having been long since deserted, but that if she would wait a little, I'd see whether there was anything in the shape of a ladder by which she could ascend to the deck. Then we'd make a search through the vessel together. A little later, on the opposite side of the decks, I found a rope side ladder. Well, this I carried across, and a minute afterwards she was beside me. Together we explored the cabins and apartments in the after part of the ship, but nowhere was there any sign of life. Here and there, within the cabins themselves, we came across odd patches of that queer fungus, but this, as my sweetheart said, could be cleansed away. In the evening, having assured ourselves that the after portion of the vessel was empty, we picked our ways to the bows, between the ugly grey nodules of that strange growth, and here we made a further search, which told us that there was indeed none aboard but ourselves. This being now beyond any doubt, we returned to the stern of the ship and proceeded to make ourselves as comfortable as possible. Together we cleared out and cleaned 2 of the cabins, and after that I made examination whether there was anything eatable in the ship. This I soon found was so. Thank God in my heart for his goodness. In addition to this, I discovered the whereabouts of the fresh water pump, and having fixed it, I found the water drinkable, though somewhat unpleasant to the taste. For several days we stayed aboard the ship, without attempting to get to the shore. We were busily engaged in making the place habitable. Yet even thus early we became aware that our lot was even less to be desired than might have been imagined. For though, as a first step, we scraped away the odd patches of growth that studded the floors and walls of the cabins and saloon, they returned almost to their original size within the space of 24 hours, which not only discouraged us, but gave us a feeling of vague unease. Still, we would not admit ourselves beaten, so we set to work afresh, and not only scraped away the fungus, but soaked the places where it had been with carbolic, a canful of which I'd found in the pantry. Yet, by the end of the week, the growth had returned in full strength, and, in addition, it had spread to other places, as though our touching it had allowed germs from it to travel elsewhere. On the 7th morning, my sweetheart woke to find a small patch of it growing on her pillow, close to her face. At that, she came to me, as soon as she could get her garments upon her. I was in the galley at the time, lighting the fire for breakfast. "Come here, John," she said, and led me aft. When I saw the thing upon her pillow, I shuddered, and then and there we agreed to go right off the ship and see if we could not fare to make ourselves more comfortable ashore. Well, hurriedly we gathered together our few belongings, and even among those I found the fungus had been at work, for one of her shawls had a little lump of it growing near one edge. I threw the whole thing over the side without saying anything to her. The raft was still alongside, but it was too clumsy to guide, and I lowered down a small boat that hung across the stern, and in this we made our way to the shore. And yet, as we drew near to it, I became gradually aware that here the vile fungus which had driven us from the ship was growing riot. In places it rose into horrible, fantastic mounds, which seemed almost to quiver, as with a quiet life when the wind blew across them. Here and there it took on the forms of vast fingers, and in others it just spread out flat and smooth and treacherous. Odd places it appeared as grotesque, stunted trees, seeming extraordinarily kinked and gnarled, while the whole quaking vilely at times. At first it seemed to us that there was no single portion of the surrounding shore which was not hidden beneath the masses of the hideous lichen. Yet in this I found we were mistaken, for somewhat later, coasting along the shore at a little distance, we descried a smooth white patch of what appeared to be fine sand, and there we landed. It wasn't sand. What it was, I do not know. All that I have observed is that upon it the fungus will not grow, while everywhere else, save where the sand-like earth wanders oddly, pathwise amid the grey desolation of the lichen, there is nothing but loathsome greyness. Oh, it's difficult to make you understand how cheered we were to find one place that was absolutely free from the growth, and here we deposited our belongings. Then we went back to the ship for such things as it seemed to us we should need. Among other matters, I managed to bring ashore with me one of the ship's sails, which I constructed 2 small tents from, which, though exceedingly rough-shaped, served the purposes for which they were intended. In these we lived and stored our various necessities, and thus for a matter of some 4 weeks all went smoothly and without particular unhappiness. Indeed, may I say with much happiness, for we were together. It was on the thumb of her right hand that the growth first showed. It was only a small circular spot, much like a little grey mole, but my God, how the fear leaped to my heart when she showed me the place. We cleansed it between us, washing it with carbolic and water. In the morning of the following day, she showed her hand to me again. The grey, warty thing had returned. For a little while we looked at one another in silence. Then, still wordless, she started to remove it. In the midst of the operation, she spoke suddenly. "What's that on the side of your face, dear?" Her voice was sharp with anxiety. I put my hand up to feel. "There, under the hair by your ear, a little bit to the front." My finger rested upon the place, and then I knew. "Let's get your thumb done first," I said, and she submitted, only because she was afraid to touch me until it was cleansed. I finished washing and disinfecting her thumb, and then she turned to my face. After it was finished, we sat together and talked a while of many things, for there had come into our lives sudden, very terrible thoughts. We were, all at once, afraid of something worse than death. We spoke of loading the boat with provisions and water and making our way out onto the sea. Yet we were helpless, for many causes, and the growth had attacked us already. We decided to stay. God would do with us what was His will, and we would wait. A month, 2 months, 3 months passed, and the places grew somewhat, and there had come others. Yet we fought so strenuously with the fear that its headway was but slow, comparatively speaking. Occasionally we ventured off to the ship for such stores as we needed. There we found that the fungus grew persistently. One of the nodules on the main deck soon became as high as my head. We'd now given up all thought or hope of leaving the island. We'd realized that it would be unallowable to go among healthy humans with the things from which we were suffering anyway. With this determination and knowledge in our minds, we knew that we should have to husband our food and water, for we did not know at that time, but that we should possibly live for many years. This reminds me that I've told you that I am an old man. Judged by years, this is not so, but... He broke off, then continued somewhat abruptly. "As I was saying, We knew that we should have to use care in the matter of food, but we had no idea then how little food there was left of which to take care. It was a week later that I made the discovery that all the other bread tanks, which I'd supposed full, were empty, and that, beyond odd tins of vegetables and meat, and some other matters, we had nothing on which to depend but the bread in the tank which I'd already opened. After learning this, I bestirred myself to do what I could, and set to work at fishing in the lagoon, but with no success. At this I was somewhat inclined to feel desperate, until the thought came to me to try outside the lagoon, in the open sea. Well, here at times I caught odd fish, but so infrequently that they proved to be little help in keeping us from the hunger which threatened. It seemed to me that our deaths were more likely to come by hunger, and not by the growth of the thing that had seized upon our bodies. We were in this state of mind when the 4th month wore out. Then I made a very horrible discovery. One morning, a little before midday, I came from the ship with a portion of the biscuits which were left. And in the mouth of her tent, I saw my sweetheart sitting, eating something. "What is it, my dear?" I called out as I leapt ashore. Yet on hearing my voice, she seemed confused, and turning, slyly threw something toward the edge of the little clearing. It fell short, and a vague suspicion having arisen within me, I walked across and picked it up. It was a piece of the grey fungus. As I went to her with it in my hand, she turned deadly pale, then a rose red. I felt strangely dazed and frightened. "Oh, my dear, I said, and could say no more. Yet at my words she broke down and cried bitterly. Gradually, as she calmed, I got from her the news that she'd tried it the day before, and liked it. I got her to promise on her knees not to touch it again, however great our hunger. After she promised, she told me that the desire for it had come suddenly, and that, until the moment of that desire, she'd experienced nothing toward it but most extreme repulsion. Later in the day, feeling strangely restless and much shaken with the thing which I had discovered, I made my way along one of the twisted paths, formed by the white, sand-like substance which led among the fungoid growth. I had once before ventured along there, but not to any great distance. This time, being involved in perplexing thought, I went much farther than hitherto. Suddenly I was called to myself by a queer, hoarse sound on my left. Turning quickly, I saw that there was a movement among the extraordinary shaped mass of fungus, close to my elbow. It was swaying uneasily, as though it possessed a life of its own. Abruptly, as I stared, the thought came to me that the thing had a grotesque resemblance to the figure of a distorted human creature. Even as the fancy flashed into my brain, there was a slight, sickening noise of tearing, and I saw that one of the branch-like arms was detaching itself from the surrounding grey masses and coming toward me. The head of the thing, a shapeless grey ball, inclined in my direction. I stood stupidly, and the vile arm brushed against my face. I gave out a frightened cry and ran back a few paces. There was a sweetish taste upon my mouth where the thing had touched me. I licked them and was immediately filled with an inhuman desire. I turned and seized a mass of the fungus, and then more and more. I was insatiable. In the midst of devouring, the remembrance of the morning's discovery swept into my mazed brain. It was sent by God. I dashed the fragment I held to the ground. Then, utterly wretched and feeling a dreadful guiltiness, I made my way back to the little encampment. I think she knew, by some marvellous intuition which love must have given, so soon as she set her eyes on me. Her quiet sympathy made it easier for me, and I told her of my sudden weakness, yet omitted to mention the extraordinary thing which had gone before. I desired to spare her all unnecessary terror. But for myself, I added an intolerable knowledge to breed an incessant terror in my brain, for I doubted not but that I had seen the end of one of those men who had come to the island in the ship in the lagoon, and in that monstrous ending I'd seen our own. Thereafter we kept from the abominable food, though the desire for it had entered into our blood. Yet our drear punishment was on us, for day by day, with monstrous rapidity, the fungoid growth took hold of our poor bodies. Nothing we could do would check it immaterially, and so we who'd been human became, well, it matters less each day. Only we had been man and maid, and day by day the fight is more dreadful to withstand the hunger lust for the terrible lichen. A week ago, we ate the last of the biscuit, and since that time I've caught 3 fish. I was out here fishing tonight when your schooner drifted upon me out of the mist. God, I hailed you, and you know the rest. And may God, out of his great heart, bless you for your goodness to a couple of poor outcast souls. There was a dip of an oar, and another. Then the voice came again, and for the last time, sounding through the slight surrounding mist, ghostly and mournful. God bless you. Goodbye, we shouted together hoarsely, our hearts full of many emotions. I glanced about me. I became aware that the dawn was now upon us. The sun flung a stray beam across the hidden sea, pierced the mist dully, and lit up the receding boat with a gloomy fire. Indistinctly I saw something nodding between the oars. I thought of a sponge, a great, grey, nodding sponge. The oars continued to ply. They were grey, as was the boat, and my eyes searched a moment vainly for the conjunction of hand and oar. My gaze flashed back to the head. It nodded forward as the oars went backward for the stroke. Then the oars were dipped, the boat shot out of the patch of light, and the thing went nodding into the mist.
The Isle of the Torturers by Clark Ashton Smith.
Between the sun's departure and return, the silver death had fallen upon Yoros. Its advent, however, had been told in many prophecies, both immemorial and recent. Astrologers had said that this mysterious malady, heretofore unknown on earth, would descend from the great star, Achernar, which presided balefully over all the lands of the southern continent of Zothique, and having sealed the flesh of a myriad men with its bright metallic pallor, the plague would still go onward in time and space, borne by the dim currents of ether to other worlds. Dire was the silver death, and no one knew the secret of its contagion or the cure. Swift as the desert wind, it came into Yoros from the devastated realm of Tarsun, overtaking the very messengers who ran by night to give warning of its nearness. Those who were smitten felt an icy, freezing cold, an instant rigor, as if the outermost gulf had breathed upon them. Their faces and bodies whitened strangely, gleaming with a wan luster, and became stiff as long-dead corpses, all in the interim of minutes. In the streets of Silpon and Siloa, and in Farad, the capital of Yoros, the plague passed like an eerie, glittering light from countenance to countenance under the golden lamps, and the victims fell where they were stricken, and the deathly brightness remained upon them. The loud, tumultuous public carnivals were stifled by its passing, and the merrymakers were frozen in frolic attitudes. In proud mansions, the wine-flushed revellers grew pale amid their garish feasts, and reclined in their opulent chairs, still holding the half-emptied cups with rigid fingers. Merchants lay in their counting-houses on the heaped coins they'd begun to reckon, and thieves, entering later, were unable to depart with their booty. Diggers died in the half-completed graves they dug for others, but no one came to dispute their possession. There was no time to flee from the strange, inevitable scourge. Dreadfully and quickly, beneath the clear stars, it breathed upon Yoros, and few were they who awakened from slumber at dawn. Fulbra, the young king of Yoris, who had but newly succeeded to the throne, was virtually a ruler without a people. Fulbra had spent the night of the plague's advent on a high tower of his palace above Farad, an observatory tower equipped with astronomical appliances. A great heaviness had lain on his heart, and his thoughts were dulled with an opiate despair, but sleep was remote from his eyelids. He knew the many predictions that foretold the Silver Death, and moreover he'd read its imminent coming in the stars, with the aid of the old astrologer and sorcerer, Vemdes. This latter knowledge he and Vemdes had not cared to promulgate, knowing full well that the doom of Yoris was a thing decreed from all time by infinite destiny, and that no man could evade the doom, unless it were written that he should die in another way than this. Now Vemdes had cast the horoscope of Fulbra, and though he found therein certain ambiguities that his science could not resolve, it was nevertheless written plainly that the king would not die in Yoris. Where he would die and in what manner were alike doubtful, but Vemdes, who had served Altaf, the father of Fulbra, and was no less devoted to the new ruler, had wrought by means of his magical art an enchanted ring that would protect Fulbra from the Silver Death in all times and places. The ring was made of a strange red metal, darker than ruddy gold or copper, and was set with a black and oblong gem, not known to terrestrial lapidaries, that gave forth eternally strong aromatic perfume. The sorcerer told Fulbra never to remove the ring from the middle finger on which he wore it, not even in lands afar from Yoris, and in days after the passing of the Silver Death, for if once the plague had breathed upon Fulbra, he would bear its subtle contagion always in his flesh, and the contagion would assume its wonted virulence with the ring's removal. But Vemdes did not tell the origin of the red metal and the dark gem, nor the price at which the protective magic had been purchased. With a sad heart, Fulbra had accepted the ring and had worn it, and so it was that the Silver Death blew over him in the night and harmed him not. But waiting anxiously on the high tower, and watching the golden lights of Farad rather than the white, implacable stars, he felt a light, passing chillness that belonged not to the summer air. And even as it passed, the gay noises of the city ceased, and the moaning lutes faltered strangely and expired. The stillness crept on the carnival, and some of the lamps went out and were not relit. In the palace beneath him there was also silence, and he heard no more the laughter of his courtiers and chamberlains. And Vemdes came not, as was his custom, to join Fulbra on the tower at midnight. So Fulbra knew himself for a realmless king, and the grief that he still felt for the noble Altaf was swollen by a great sorrow for his perished people. Hour by hour he sat motionless, too sorrowful for tears. The stars changed above him, and Akhenar glared down perpetually like the bright, cruel eye of a mocking demon, and the heavy balsam of the black jewelled ring arose to his nostrils and seemed to stifle him. And once the thought occurred to Fulbra to cast the ring away and die as his people had died, but his despair was too heavy upon him for even this. And so, at length, the dawn came slowly in heavens as pale as the Silver Death, and found him still on the tower. In the dawn, King Fulbra rose and descended the coiled stairs of the porphyry into his palace, and midway on the stairs he saw the fallen corpse of the old sorcerer Vemdes, who had died even as he climbed to join his master. The wrinkled face of Vemdes was like polished metal, and was whiter than his beard and hair, and his open eyes, which had been dark as sapphires, were frosted with the plague. Then, grieving greatly for the death of Vemdes, whom he had loved as a foster father, the king went slowly on. And in the suites and halls below, he found the bodies of his courtiers and servants and guardsmen, and none remained alive, excepting 3 slaves who warded the green, brazen portals of the lower vaults, far beneath the palace. Now Fulbra bethought him of the counsel of Vemdes, who had urged him to flee from Yoris and to seek shelter in the southern isle of Sintram. which paid tribute to the kings of Eurus. And though he'd no heart for this, nor for any course of action, Fulbra bade the 3 remaining slaves to gather food and such other supplies as were necessary for a voyage of some length, and to carry them aboard a royal barge of ebony that was moored at the palace porticos on the river Voom. Then, embarking with the slaves, he took the helm of the barge and directed the slaves to unfurl the broad amber sail, and past the stately city of Farad, whose streets were thronged with the silvery dead, they sailed on the widening jasper estuary of the Valm and into the amaranth-coloured gulf of the Induskian Sea. The favourable wind was behind them, blowing from the north over the desolate Tassoon and Eurus, even as the silver death had blown in the night. And idly beside them, on the Voom, there floated seaward many vessels whose crews and captains had all died of the plague. And Farad was still as a necropolis of old time, and nothing stirred on the estuary shores, excepting the plumy, fan-shapen palms that swayed southward in the freshening wind. And soon the green strand of Eurus receded, gathering to itself the blueness and the dreams of distance. Creaming with a winy foam, full of strange murmurous voices and vague tales of exotic things, the Halcyon Sea was about the voyagers now, beneath the high-lifting summer sun. But the sea's enchanted voices and its long, languorous, immeasurable crailing could not soothe the sorrow of Fulbra, and in his heart a despair abided, black as the gem that was set in the ring of Vamdes. Howbeit he held the great helm of the Ebon barge, and steered as straightly as he could by the sun towards Sintram. The amber sail was taut with the favouring wind, and the barge sped onward all that day, cleaving the amaranth waters with its dark prow that reared in the carved form of an ebony goddess. And when the night came, with the familiar austral stars, Fulbra was able to correct such errors as he'd made in reckoning the course. For many days they flew southward, and the sun lowered a little in its circling behind them, and new stars climbed and clustered at evening about the black goddess of the prow. And Fulbra, who had once sailed to the Isle of Simtram in his boyhood days with his father Altaf, thought to see here, along the lifting of its shores, of camphor and sandalwood from the winy deep. But in his heart there was no gladness, and often now he was blinded by wild tears, remembering that other voyage with Altaf. Then, suddenly, and at high noon, there fell an airless cabin, and the waters became as purple glass about the barge. The sky changed to a dome of beaten copper, arcing close and low, and, as if by some evil wizardry, the dome darkened with untimely night, and a tempest rose like the gathered breath of mighty devils, and shaped the sea into vast ridges and abysmal valleys. The mast of ebony snapped like a reed in the wind, and the sail was torn asunder, and the helpless vessel pitched headlong into the dark troughs, and was hurled upward through veils of blinding foam to the giddy summits of the billows. Fulbra clung to the useless helm, and the slaves, at his command, took shelter in the forward cabin. For countless hours they were borne onward at the will of the mad hurricane, and Fulbra could see naught in the lowering gloom, except the pale crests of the beetling waves, and he could no longer tell the direction of their course. Then, in that lurid dusk, he beheld at intervals another vessel that rode the storm-driven sea, not far from the barge. He thought that the vessel was a galley such as might be used by merchants that voyaged among the southern isles, trading for incense and plumes and vermilion. But its oars were mostly broken, and the topmast and sail hung forward on the prow. For a time the ships drove on together, till Fulbra saw, in a rifting of the gloom, the sharp and sombre crags of an unknown shore, with sharper towers that lifted palely above them. He could not turn the helm, and the barge and its companion vessel were carried toward the looming rocks, till Fulbra thought that they would crash thereon. But, as if by some enchantment, even as it had risen, the sea fell abruptly in a windless calm, and quiet sunlight poured from a clearing sky, and the barge was left on a broad crescent of ochre-yellow sand between the crags and the lulling waters, with the galley beside it. Dazed and marvelling, Fulbra leaned on the helm, while his slaves crept timidly forth from the cabin, and men began to appear on the decks of the galley. And the king was about to hail these men, some of whom were dressed as humble sailors, and others in the fashion of rich merchants. But he heard a laughter of strange voices, high and shrill and somehow evil, that seemed to fall from above. And looking up, he saw that many people were descending a sort of stairway in the cliffs that enclosed the beach. The people drew near, thronging about the barge and the galley. They wore fantastic turbans of blood red, and were clad in closely fitting robes of vulturine black. Their faces and hands were yellow as saffron. Their small and slutty eyes were set obliquely beneath lashless lids, and their thin lips, which smiled eternally, were crooked as the blades of scimitars. They bore sinister and wicked-looking weapons, in the form of saw-toothed swords and double-headed spears. Some of them bowed low before Fulbra and addressed him obsequiously, staring upon him all the while with an unblinking gaze that he could not fathom. Their speech was no less alien than their aspect. It was full of sharp and hissing sounds, and neither the king nor his slaves could comprehend it. But Fulbra bespoke the court courteously, in the mild and mellow flowing tongue of Yoros, and inspired the name of his land whereon the barge had been cast by the tempest. Certain of the people seemed to understand him, for a light came in their slutty eyes at his question, and one of them answered brokenly in the language of Yoros, saying that the land was the Isle of Ukastrog. Then, with something of a covert evil in his smile, this person added that all shipwrecked mariners and seafarers would receive a goodly welcome from Ildrak, the king of the isle. At this, the heart of Fulbra sank within him, for he had heard numerous tales of Ukastrog in bygone years, and the tales were not such as would reassure a stranded traveller. Ukastrog, which lay far to the east of Sintram, was known commonly as the Isle of the Torturers. And men said that all who landed upon it unaware, or were cast thither by the seas, were imprisoned by the inhabitants and were subjected later to unending curious tortures, whose infliction formed the chief delight of these cruel beings. No man, it was rumoured, had ever escaped from Ukastrog, but many had lingered for years in its dungeons and hellish torture chambers, kept alive for the pleasure of King Ildrak and his followers. Also, it was believed that the torturers were great magicians who could raise mighty storms with their enchantments, and could cause vessels to be carried far from the maritime routes, and then fling them ashore upon Ukastrog. Seeing that the yellow people were all about the barge and that no escape was possible, Fulbra asked them to take him at once before King Ildrak. To Ildrak he would announce his name and royal rank, and it seemed to him, in his simplicity, that one king, even though cruel-hearted, would scarcely torture another or keep him captive. Also, it might be that the inhabitants of Ukastrog had been somewhat maligned by the tales of travellers. So Fulbra and his slaves were surrounded by certain of the throng and were led toward the palace of Ildrak, whose high, sharp towers crowned the crags beyond the beach, rising above those clustered abodes in which the island people dwelt. And while they were climbing the hewn steps in the cliff, Fulbra heard a loud outcry below and a clashing of steel against steel. And looking back, he saw that the crew of the stranded galley had drawn their swords and were fighting the islanders. But they were outnumbered greatly, and their resistance was borne down by the swarming torturers, and most of them were taken alive. And Fulbra's heart misgave him sorely at this sight, and more did he mistrust the yellow people. Soon he came into the presence of Ildrak, who sat on a lofty brazen chair in a vast hall of the palace. Ildrak was taller by half a head than any of his followers, and his features were like a mask of evil wrought from some pale, gilded metal, and he was clad in vestments of a strange hue, like sea purple brightened with fresh, flowing blood. About him were many guardsmen, armed with terrible scythe-like weapons, and the sullen, slant-eyed girls of the palace, in skirts of vermilion and breast cups of lazuli, went to and fro among huge basaltic columns. About the hall stood numerous engineries of wood and stone and metal, such as Fulborough had never beheld, and having a formidable aspect, with their heavy chains, their beds of iron teeth, and their cords, and their pulleys of fish skin. The young king of Yoros went forward with a royal and fearless bearing, and addressed Ildrak, who sat motionless and eyed him with a level, unwinking gaze. And Fulborough told Ildrak his name and station, and the calamity that had caused him to flee from Yoros, and he mentioned also his urgent desire to reach the Isle of Sintram. "It is a long voyage to Sintram," said Ildrak with a subtle smile. "Also, it is not our custom to permit guests to depart without fully having tasted the hospitality of the Isle of Ukastrog. Therefore, King Fulborough, I must beg you to curb your impatience. We have much to show you here, and many diversions to offer. My chamberlains will now conduct you to a room befitting your royal rank. But first I must ask you to leave with me the sword that you carry at your side, for swords are often sharp, and I do not wish my guests to suffer injury by their own hands." So Fulborough's sword was taken from him by one of the palace guardsmen, and a small ruby-hilted dagger that he carried was also removed. Then several of the guards, hemming him in with their scythe weapons, led him from the hall and by many corridors and downward flights of stairs into the soft rock beneath the palace. And he knew not whither his 3 slaves were taken, or what disposition was made of the captured crew of the galley. And soon he passed from the daylight into cavernous halls illumined by sulphur-coloured flames in copper cressets, and all around him, in hidden chambers, he heard the sound of dismal moans and loud maniacal howlings that seemed to beat and die upon adamantine doors. In one of these halls, Fulborough and his guardsmen met a young girl, fairer and less sullen of aspect than the others, and Fulborough thought that the girl smiled upon him compassionately as he went by, and it seemed that she murmured faintly in the language of Yoros, "Take heart, King Fulborough, for there is one who would help you." And the words were, apparently, not heeded or understood by the guards, who knew only the harsh and hissing tongue of Ukastrol. After descending many stairs, they came to a ponderous door of bronze, and the door was unlocked by one of the guards, and Fulborough was compelled to enter, and the door clanged dolorously behind him. The chamber into which he had been thrust was walled on 3 sides with the dark stone of the island, and was walled on the 4th with heavy, unbreakable glass. Beyond the glass he saw the blue-green, glimmering waters of the undersea, lit by the hanging cressets of the chamber, and in the waters were great devilfish whose tentacles writhed along the wall, and huge pythonomorphs with fabulous golden coils receding in the gloom, and the floating corpses of men that stared in upon him with eyeballs from which the lids had been excised. There was a couch in one corner of the dungeon, close to the wall of glass, and food and drink had been supplied for Fulborough in vessels of wood. The king laid himself down, weary and hopeless, without tasting the food, and then, lying with close-shut eyes while the dead men and sea monsters peered in upon him by the glare of the cressets, he strove to forget his griefs and the dolorous doom that impended. And through his clouding terror and sorrow, he seemed to see the comely face of the girl who'd smiled upon him with compassion, and who, alone of all he'd met in Ukastrog, had spoken to him with words of kindness. The face returned ever and anon with a soft haunting, a gentle sorcery, and Fulborough felt, for the first time in many suns, the dim stirring of his buried youth and the vague, obscure desire of life. So, after a while, he slept, and the face of the girl came still before him in his dreams. The cressets burned above him with undiminished flames when he awakened, and the sea beyond the wall of glass was thronged with the same monsters as before, or with others of like kind. But amid the floating corpses he now beheld the flayed bodies of his own slaves, who, after being tortured by the island people, had been cast forth into the submarine cavern that adjoined his dungeon, so that he might see them on awakening. He sickened with new horror at the sight, but even as he stared at the dead faces, the door of bronze swung open with a sullen grinding, and his guards entered. Seeing that he had not consumed the food and water provided for him, they forced him to eat and drink a little, menacing him with their broad, crooked blades till he complied. And then they led him from the dungeon and took him before King Ildrak in the great hall of tortures. Fulbra saw by the level golden light through the palace windows and the long shadows of the columns and machines of torment that the time was early dawn. The hall was crowded with the torturers and their women, and many seemed to look on while others, of both sexes, busied themselves with ominous preparations. And Fulbra saw that a tall brazen statue, with cruel and demonian visage like some implacable god of the underworld, was now standing at the right hand of Ildrak, where he sat aloft on his brazen chair. Fulbra was thrust forward by his guards, and Ildrak greeted him briefly with a wily smile that preceded the words and lingered after them. And when Ildrak had spoken, the brazen image also began to speak, addressing Fulbra in the language of Yoros, with strident and metallic tones, and telling him with full and minute circumstance the various infernal tortures to which he was to be subjected on that day. When the statue had done speaking, Fulbra heard a soft whisper in his ear, and saw beside him the fair girl whom he had previously met in nether corridors. And the girl, seemingly unheeded by the torturers, said to him, "Be courageous, and endure bravely all that is inflicted, for I shall effect your release before another day, if this be possible." Fulbra was cheered by the girl's assurance, and it seemed to him that she was fairer to look upon than before, and he thought that her eyes regarded him tenderly, and the twin desires of love and life were strangely resurrected in his heart, to fortify him against the tortures of Ildrak. Of that which was done to Fulbra for the wicked pleasure of King Ildrak and his people, it were not well to speak fully. For the islanders of Ukastrog had designed innumerable torments, curious and subtle, wherewith to harry and extricate the five senses, and they would harry the brain itself, driving it to extremes more terrible than madness, and could take away the dearest treasures of memory and leave unutterable foulness in their place. On that day, however, they did not torture Fulbra to the uttermost, but they racked his ears with cacophonous sounds, with evil flutes that chilled the blood and curdled it upon his heart, with deep drums that seemed to ache in all of his tissues, and thin tabors that wrenched his very bones. They then compelled him to breathe the mounting fumes of braziers wherein the dry gall of dragons and the adipocry of dead cannibals were burned together with fetid wood. Then, when the fire had died down, they freshened it with the oil of vampire bats, and Fulbra swooned, unable to bear the fetor any longer. Later they stripped away his kingly vestments and fastened about his body a silken girdle that had been freshly dipped in acid corrosive only to human flesh, and the acid ate slowly, fretting his skin with infinite pangs. Then, after removing the girdle lest it slay him, the torturers brought in certain creatures that had the shape of elong serpents, but were covered from head to tail with sable hairs like those of a caterpillar. And these creatures twined themselves tightly about the arms and legs of Fulbra, and though he fought wildly in his revulsion, he could not loosen them with his hands, and the hairs that covered their constringent coils began to pierce his limbs like a million tiny needles, till he screamed with agony. And when his breath failed him, and he could no longer scream, the baby serpents were induced to relinquish their hold by a languorous piping of which the islanders knew the secret. They dropped away and left him, but the mark of their coils was imprinted readily about his limbs, and around his body there burned the raw branding of the girdle. King Ildrak and his people looked on with a dreadful gloating, for in such things they took their joy, and strove to pacify an implacable obscure desire. But seeing now that Fulbra could endure no more, and wishing to wreak their will upon him for many future days, they took him back to his dungeon. Lying sick with remembered horror, feverish with pain, he longed not for the clemency of death, but hoped for the coming of the girl to release him as she had promised. The long hours passed with a half-delirious tedium, and the cressets, whose flames had been changed to crimson, appeared to fill his eyes with flowing blood, and the dead men and the sea monsters swam as if in blood beyond the wall of glass. And the girl came not, and Fulbra had begun to despair. Then, at last, he heard the door open gently, and not with the harsh clangor that had proclaimed the entrance of his guards. Turning, he saw the girl, who stole swiftly to his couch with a lifted fingertip, enjoining silence. She told him with soft whispers that her plan had failed, but surely on the following night she would be able to drug the guards and obtain the keys to the outer gates, and Fulbra could escape from the palace to a hidden cove in which a boat with water and provisions lay ready for his use. She prayed him to endure for another day the torments of Ildrak, and to this, perforce, he consented. And he thought that the girl loved him, for tenderly she caressed his feverish brow, and rubbed his torturous burning limbs with the soothing ointment. He deemed that her eyes were soft with a compassion that was more than pity, and so Fulbra believed the girl and trusted her, and took heart against the horror of the coming day. Her name, it seemed, was Ilvar, and her mother was a woman of Yoros who had married one of the evil islanders, choosing this repugnant union as an alternative to the flaying knives of Ildrak. Too soon the girl went away, pleading the great danger of discovery, and closed the door softly upon Fulbra. And after a while the king slept, and Ilvar returned to him amid the delirious abominations of his dreams, and sustained him against the terror of strange hells. At dawn the guards came with their hooked weapons, and led him again before Ildrak. And again the brazen, demonic statue, in a strident voice, announced the fearful ordeals that he was to undergo. And this time he saw that other captives, including the crew and merchants of the galley, were also awaiting the malefic ministrations of the torturers in the vast hall. Once more in the throng of watchers, the girl Ilvar pressed close to him, unreprimanded by his guards, and murmured words of comfort, so that Fulbra was enheartened against the enormities foretold by the brazen oracular image. And indeed, a bold and hopeful heart was required to endure the ordeals of that day. Among other things less goodly to be mentioned, the torturers held before Fulbra a mirror of strange wizardry, wherein his own face was reflected as if seen after death. The rigid features, as he gazed upon them, became marked with the green and bluish marbling of corruption, and the withering flesh fell in on the sharp bones and displayed the visible fretting of the worm. Hearing meanwhile the dolorous groans and agonizing cries of his fellow captives all about the hall, he beheld other faces, dead, swollen, lidless and flayed, that seemed to approach him from behind and to throng about his own face in the mirror. Their looks were dank and dripping, like the hair of corpses recovered from the sea, and seaweed was mingled within the locks. Then, turning at a cold and clammy touch, he found that these faces were no illusion, but the actual reflection of cadavers drawn from the undersea by a malign sorcery that had entered the hall of Ildrak like living men and were peering over his shoulder. His own slaves, with flesh that the sea things had gnawn even to the bone, were among them, and the slaves came toward him with glaring eyes that saw only the voidness of death. And beneath the sorcerous control of Ildrak, their evilly animated corpses began to assail Fulbra, clawing at his face and raiment with half-eaten fingers. And Fulbra, faint with loathing, struggled against his dead slaves, who knew not the voice of their master, and were as deaf as the wheels and racks of torment used by Ildrak. Anon, the drowned and dripping corpses went away, and Fulbra was stripped by the torturers and was laid supine on the palace floor, with iron rings that bound him closely to the flags at knee and wrist, at elbow and ankle. Then they brought in the disinterred body of a woman, nearly eaten, in which a myriad maggots swarmed on the uncovered bones and tatters of dark corruption, and this body they placed on the right hand of Fulbra. And also they fetched the carrion of a black goat that was nearly touched with beginning decay, and they laid it beside him on the left hand. Then, across Fulbra, from right to left, the hungry maggots crawled in a long and undulant wave. After the consummation of this torture, there came many others that were equally ingenious and atrocious, and were well designed for the delectation of King Ildrak and his people. And Fulbra endured the tortures valiantly, upheld by the thought of Ylva. Vainly, however, on the night that followed this day, he waited in his dungeon for the girl. The cressets burned with a bloodier crimson, and new corpses were among the flayed and floating dead in the sea cavern, and strange double-bodied serpents on the nether deep arose with an endless squirming, and their horned heads appeared to bloat immeasurably against the crystal wall. And yet the girl Ylva came not to free him as she had promised, and the night passed. But though despair resumed its old dominion in the heart of Fulbra, and terror came with talons steeped in fresh venom, he refused to doubt Ylva, telling himself that she had been delayed or prevented by some unforeseen mishap. At the dawn of the third day, he was again taken before Ildrak. The brazen image, announcing the ordeals of the day, told him that he was to be bound on a wheel of adamant, and, lying on the wheel, was to drink a drugged wine that would steal away his royal memories forever, and would conduct his naked soul on a long pilgrimage through monstrous and infamous hells, before bringing it back to the hall of Ildrak and the broken body on the wheel. Then certain women of the torturers, laughing obscenely, came forward and bound King Fulbra to the adamantine wheel with thongs of dragon guts, and after they'd done this, the girl Ylva, smiling with the shameless exultation of open cruelty, appeared before Fulbra and stood close beside him, holding a golden cup that contained the drugged wine. She mocked him for his folly and credulity in trusting her promises, and the other women and the male torturers, even to Ildrak on his brazen seat, laughed loudly and evilly at Fulbra, and praised Ylva for the perfidy she'd practiced upon him. So Fulbra's heart grew sick with a darker despair than any he had yet known. The brief, piteous love that had been born amid sorrow and agony perished within him, leaving but ashes steeped in gall. And yet gazing at Ylva with sad eyes, he uttered no word of reproach. He wished to live no longer, and yearning for a swift death, he bethought him of the wizard ring of Vemdis, and of that which Vemdis had said would follow its removal from his finger. He still wore the ring, which the torturers had deemed a bauble of small value, but his hands were bound tightly to the wheel, and he could not remove it. So, with a bitter cunning, knowing full well that the islanders would not take away the ring if he should offer it to them, he feigned a sudden madness and cried wildly, "Steal my memories, if you will, with your accursed wine, and send me through 1,000 hells and bring me back again to Ukastrog. But take not the ring which I wear on my middle finger, for it is more precious to me than many kingdoms or the pale breasts of love." Well, hearing this, King Ildrak rose from his brazen seat, and bidding Ylva to delay the administration of the wine, he came forward and inspected curiously the ring of Vemdis, which gleamed darkly, set with its rayless gem, on Fulbra's finger. And all the while Fulbra cried out against him in a frenzy, as if fearing that he would take the ring. So Ildrak, deeming that he could plague the prisoner thereby and could heighten his suffering a little, did the very thing for which Fulbra had planned. And the ring came easily from the shrunken finger, and Ildrak, wishing to mock the royal captive, placed it on his own middle digit. Then, while Ildrak regarded the captive with a more deeply graven smile of evil on the pale, gilded mask of his face, there came to King Fulbra of Eurus the dreadful and longed-for thing, the Silver Death. That had slept so long in his body beneath the magical abeyance of the Ring of Vemdes was made manifest even as he hung on the adamantine wheel. His limbs stiffened with another rigour than that of agony, and his face shone brightly with the coming of the death, and so he died. Then, to Ilvar and to many of the torturers who stood wondering about the wheel, the chill and instant contagion of the Silver Death was communicated. They fell even where they'd stood, and the pestilence remained like a glittering light on the faces and the hands of the men, and shone forth from the nude bodies of the women. And the plague passed along the immense hall, and the other captives of King Ildrak were released thereby from their various torments, and the torturers found surcease from the dire longing that they could assuage only through the pain of their fellow men. And through all the palace, and throughout the Isle of Ukastrok, the death fell swiftly, visible in those upon whom it had breathed, but otherwise unseen and impalpable. But Ildrak, wearing the Ring of Vemdes, was immune, and guessing not the reason for his immunity, he beheld with consternation the doom that had overtaken his followers, and watched in stupefaction the freeing of his victims. Then, fearful of some inimic sorcery, he rushed from the hall, and standing in the early sun on a palace terrace above the sea, he tore the Ring of Vemdes from his finger and hurled it to the foamy billows far below, deeming in his terror that the ring was perhaps the source or agent of the unknown hostile magic. And so Ildrak, in his turn, when all the others had fallen, was smitten by the Silver Death, and its peace descended upon him where he lay in his robes of blood-brightened purple, with features shining palely to the unclouded sun. And oblivion claimed the Isle of Ukastrok, and the torturers were one with the tortured.
Derelict by William Hope Hodgson.
"It's the material," said the old ship's doctor. "The material plus the conditions and, maybe," he added slowly, "a third factor. Yes, a third factor, but there... He broke off his half-meditative sentence and began to charge his pipe. "Go on, Doctor," we said encouragingly, and with more than a little expectancy. We were in the smoke room of the Sandalay, running across the North Atlantic, and the doctor was a character. He concluded the charging of his pipe and lit it, and then settled himself, and began to express himself more fully. "The material," he said with conviction, "is inevitably the medium of expression of the life force, the fulcrum, as it were, lacking which it is unable to exert itself, or indeed to express itself in any form or fashion that will be intelligible or evident to us. So potent is the share of the material in the production of that thing which we name life, and so eager the life force to express itself, that I am convinced it would, if given the right conditions, make itself manifest even through so hopeless seeming a medium as a simple block of sawn wood. For I tell you, gentlemen, the life force is both as fiercely urgent and as indiscriminate as fire, the destructor, yet which some are now growing to consider the very essence of life rampant. There's a quaint seeming paradox there," he concluded, nodding his old grey head. "Yes, Doctor," I said. "In brief, your argument is that life is a thing, state, fact, or element, call it what you like, which requires the material through which to manifest itself, and that given the material plus the conditions, the result is life. In other words, that life is an involved product, manifested through matter and bred of conditions, eh?" "As we understand the word," said the old doctor, "though, mind you, there may be a third factor. But, in my heart, I believe that it's a matter of chemistry, conditions in a suitable medium, But given the conditions, the brute is so almighty that it will seize upon anything through which to manifest itself. It is a force generated by conditions, but nevertheless this does not bring us one iota nearer to its explanation, any more than to the explanation of electricity or fire. They are, all three, of the outer forces, monsters of the void. Nothing we can do will create any one of them. Our power is merely to be able, by providing the conditions, to make each one of them manifest to our physical senses. Am I clear?
Yes, Doctor.
In a way you are, I said, but I don't agree with you, though I think I understand you. Electricity and fire are both what I call natural things, but life is an abstract something, a kind of all-permeating wakefulness. Oh, I can't explain it. Who could? But it is spiritual, not just a thing bred out of a condition, like fire, as you say, or electricity. It is a horrible thought of yours. Life's a kind of spiritual mystery. Easy, my boy, said the old doctor, laughing gently to himself. Or else I may be asking you to demonstrate the spiritual mystery of life, of the limpet or the crab, shall we say. He grinned at me with ineffable perverseness. Anyway, he continued, as I suppose you've all guessed, I've a yarn to tell you in support of my impression that life is no more a mystery or a miracle than fire or electricity. But please to remember, gentlemen, that because we've succeeded in naming and making good use of these two forces, they are just as much mysteries, fundamentally now, as ever. And, anyway, the thing I'm going to tell you won't explain the mystery of life, but only give you one of my pegs on which I hang my feeling that life is, as I've said, a force made manifest through conditions. That is to say, natural chemistry, and that it can take for its purpose and need the most incredible and unlikely matter. For without matter it cannot come into existence. It cannot become manifest. Oh, I don't agree with you, Doctor, I interrupted. Your theory would destroy all belief in life after death. It would... Hush, sonny, said the old man with a quiet little smile of comprehension. Hark to what I have to say first, and anyway, what objection have you to material life after death? And if you object to a material framework, I would still have you remember that I am speaking of life, as we understand the word in this, our life. Now do be quiet, lad, or I'll never be done. Well, it was when I was a young man, and that's a good many years ago, gentlemen. I passed my examinations, but was so run down with overwork that it was decided that I'd better take a trip to sea. I was by no means well off, and very glad in the end to secure a nominal post as doctor in the sailing passenger clipper running out to China. The name of the ship was Beopse, and soon after I got all my gear aboard, she cast off, and we dropped down the Thames, and next day we were well out in the Channel. The captain's name was Gannington, a very decent man, though quite illiterate. The first mate, Mr. Burleys, was a quiet, sternish reserve man, very well read. The second mate, Mr. Selvan, was, perhaps by birth and upbringing, the most socially cultured of the three, but he lacked the stamina and indomitable pluck of the other two. He was more of a sensitive and, emotionally and even mentally, the most alert man of the three. On our way out, we called at Madagascar, where we landed some of our passengers. Then we ran eastward, meaning to call at Northwest Cape, but about 100 degrees east, we encountered very dreadful weather, which carried away all our sails and sprung the jibboom and the forward-gallant mast. The storm carried us northward for several hundred miles, and when it dropped us finally, we found ourselves in a very bad state. The ship had been strained, and had taken some 3 feet of water through her seams. The main topmast had been sprung, in addition to the jibboom and the forward-gallant mast. 2 of our boats had gone, as also one of the pigstays, with 3 fine pigs. These latter having been washed overboard, but some half-hour before the wind began to ease, which it did very quickly, though a very ugly sea ran for some hours after. The wind left us just before dark, and when morning came it brought weather. Splendid weather. A calm, mildly undulating sea and a brilliant sun with no wind. It showed us also that we were not alone, for about 2 miles away to the westward was another vessel, which Mr. Selvin, the second mate, pointed out to me. "That's a pretty rum-looking packet, Doctor," he said, and handed me his glass. I looked through it at the other vessel and saw what he meant. At least I thought I did. "Yes, Mr. Selvin," I said. "She's got a pretty old-fashioned look about her." Well, he laughed at me in his pleasant way. "It's easy to see you're not a sailor, Doctor," he remarked. "There's a dozen rum things about her. She's a derelict, and has been floating around by the look of her for many a score of years. Look at the shape of her counter, and the bows and cutwater. She's as old as the hills, as you might say, and ought to have gone down to Davy Jones a good while ago. Look at the growths on her, and the thickness of her standing rigging. That's all salt incrustations, I fancy. Well, if you notice the white colour. Well, she's been a small bark, but don't you see, she's not a yard left aloft. They've all dropped out of the slings, everything rotted away. Wonder the standing rigging hasn't gone too. I wish the old man had let us take the boat and have a look at her. She'd be well worth it." There seemed little chance, however, of this, for all hands were turned to and kept hard at it all day, repairing the damage to the masts and gear, and this took a long while, as you may think. Part of the time I gave a hand heaving on one of the deck capstans, for the exercise was good for my liver. Old Captain Gannington approved, and I persuaded him to come along and try some of the same medicine, which he did, and we got very chummy over the job. We got talking about the derelict, and he remarked how lucky we were not to have run full tilt onto her in the darkness, for she lay right away to the leeward of us, according to the way we'd been drifting in the storm. He was also of the opinion that she had a strange look about her, that she was pretty old, but on this latter point he plainly had far less knowledge than the second mate, for he was, as I've said, an illiterate man, and knew nothing of seacraft beyond what experience had taught him. He lacked the book knowledge which the second mate had of vessels previous to his day, which it appeared the derelict was. "She's an old 'un, Doctor," was the extent of his observations in this direction. Yet, when I mentioned to him that it would be interesting to go aboard and give her a bit of an overhaul, he nodded his head as if the idea had already been in his mind and accorded with his own inclinations. "When the work's over, Doctor," he said. "Can't spare the men now, you know. Got to keep all ship-shape and ready as smart as we can, but we'll take my jig and go off in the second dog watch. The glass is steady, and it'll be a bit of a gam for us." Well, that evening after tea, the captain gave orders to clear the jig and get her overboard. The second mate was to come with us, and the skipper gave him word to see that 2 or 3 lamps were put into the boat, as it would soon fall dark. A little later we were pulling across the calmness of the sea with a crew of 6 at the oars, and making very good speed of it. Now, gentlemen, I have detailed to you with great exactness all the facts, both big and little, so that you can follow step by step each incident in this extraordinary affair. And I want you now to pay the closest attention. I was sitting in the stern sheets with the second mate and the captain, who was steering, and as we drew nearer and nearer to the stranger, as indeed did Captain Gannington and the second mate, she was, as you know, to the westward of us, and the sunset was making a great flame of red light to the back of her, so that she showed a little blurred and indistinct by reason of the halation of the night, which almost defeated the eye in any attempt to see her rotting spars and standing rigging, submerged as they were in the fiery glory of the sunset. It was because of this effect of the sunset that we had come quite close, comparatively, to the derelict before we saw that she was all surrounded by a sort of curious scum, the colour of which was difficult to decide upon by reason of the red light that was in the atmosphere, but which afterwards we discovered to be brown. This scum spread all about the old vessel for many hundreds of yards in a huge irregular patch, a great stretch of which reached out to the eastward, upon the starboard side of the boat some score or so fathoms away. "Queer stuff," said Captain Gannington, leaning to the side and looking over. "Something in the cargo has gone rotten and worked out through her seams." Look at her bows and stern, said the second mate. Just look at the growth on her. There were, as he said, great clumpings of strange-looking sea fungi under the bows and the short counter astern. From the stump of her jibboom and the cutwater, great beards of rime and marine growths hung downward into the scum that held her in. Her blank starboard side was presented to us, all a dead, dirtyish white, streaked and mottled vaguely with dull masses of heavier colour. There's a steam or haze rising off her, said the second mate, speaking again. You can see it against the light. Ooh, it keeps coming and going. Look. Well, I saw then what he meant. A faint haze or steam, either suspended above the old vessel or rising from her. And Captain Gannington saw it also. Oh, spontaneous combustion, he exclaimed. We'll have to watch when we lift the hatches, unless it's some poor devil that's got aboard of her. But, well, that ain't likely. We were now within a couple of 100 yards of the old derelict, and had entered into the brown scum. As it poured off the lifted oars, I heard one of the men mutter to himself, "Oh, damn treacle!" And indeed, it was not something unlike it. As the boat continued to forge nearer and nearer to the old ship, the scum grew thicker and thicker, so that, at last, it perceptibly slowed us down. "Give way, lads! Put some beef into it!" sang out Captain Gannington, and thereafter there was no sound except the panting of men and the faint, reiterated suck, suck of the sullen brown scum upon the oars as the boat was forced ahead. As we went, I was conscious of a peculiar smell in the evening air, and whilst I had no doubt that the putting of the scum by the oars made it rise, I could give no name to it, yet in a way it was vaguely familiar. We were now very close to the old vessel, and presently she was high about us against the dying light. The captain called out then to "In with the boat oars and stand by the boat hook," which was done. "Aboard there! Ahoy! Aboard there! Ahoy!" shouted Captain Gannington, but there came no answer. Only the dull sound of his voice going lost into the open sea, each time he sung out. "Ahoy aboard there! Ahoy!" he shouted time after time, but there was only the weary silence of the old hulk that answered us, and somehow as he shouted, the while that I stared up half expectantly at her, a queer little sense of oppression that amounted almost to nervousness came upon me. It passed, but I remember how I was suddenly aware that it was growing dark. Now, darkness comes fairly rapidly in the tropics, though not so quickly as many fiction writers seem to think. But it was not that the coming dusk had perceptibly deepened in that brief time of only a few moments, but rather that my nerves had made me suddenly a little hypersensitive. Now, I mention my state particularly, for I'm not a nervy man normally, and my abrupt touch of nerves is significant in light of what happened. "There's no one on board there," said Captain Gannington. "Give way, men." For the boat's crew had instinctively rested on their oars as the captain hailed the old craft. The men gave way again, and then the second mate called out excitedly, "Oi, look there! There's our pigsty! See, it's got biopsy painted on the end. Oh, it's drifted down here, and the scum's caught it. Oh, what a blessed wonder!" It was, as he said, our pigsty that had been washed overboard in the storm, and most extraordinary to come across it there. "We'll tow it off with us when we go," said the captain, and shouted to the crew to get down to their oars, for they were hardly moving the boat, because the scum was so thick close in around the old ship that it literally clogged the boat from moving. I remember that it struck me, in a half-conscious sort of way, as curious that the pigsty, containing our 3 dead pigs, had managed to drift in so far unaided, whilst we could scarcely manage to force the boat in, now that we'd come right into the scum. But the thought passed from my mind, for so many things happened within the next few minutes. The man managed to bring the boat in alongside, within a couple of feet of the derelict, and the man with the boat hook hooked on. "Have you got hold there, Forrard?" asked Captain Gannington. "Yes, sir," said the bowman, and as he spoke, there came a queer noise of tearing.
"What's that?"
said the captain.
"It's tore, sir. Tore clean away,"
said the man, and his tone showed that he had received something of a shock.
"Oh, get a hold again, then,"
said Captain Gannington irritably.
"Don't suppose this packet was built yesterday? Shove the hook into the main chains."
The man did so gingerly, as you might say, for it seemed to me, in the growing dusk, that he put no strain onto the hook, though of course there was no need. You could see the boat could not go very far of herself in the stuff in which she was embedded. I remember thinking this, also, as I looked up at the bulging side of the old vessel, and then I heard Captain Gannington's voice.
"Lord, but she's old. And what a colour, Doctor. Oh, she don't want half a paint, do she? Now then, somebody, one of them oars."
An oar was passed to him, and he leant it up against the ancient bulging side. Then he paused, and called to the second mate to light a couple of the lamps, and stand by to pass them up, for darkness had settled down now upon the sea. The second mate lit 2 of the lamps, and told one of the men to light a third, and keep it handy in the boat, and then he stepped across, with a lamp in each hand, to where Captain Gannington stood by the oar against the side of the ship.
"Now, my lad,"
said the captain to the man who had pulled the stroke,
"up with you, and I'll pass you up the lamps."
Well, the man jumped to obey, caught the oar, and put his weight upon it, and as he did so, something seemed to give way a little.
"Look,"
cried out the second mate, and pointed, lamp in hand.
"It's sunk in."
This was true. The oar had made quite an indentation into the bulging, somewhat slimy side of the old vessel.
"Mould, I reckon,"
said Captain Gannington, bending towards the derelict to look, and then to the man.
"Up you go, my lad, and be smart. Don't stand there waiting."
At that, the man, who had paused a moment as he felt the oar give beneath his weight, began to shin up, and in a few seconds he was aboard, and leant out over the rail for the lamps. These were passed up to him, and the captain called to him to steady the oar. And then Captain Gannington went, calling for me to follow, and after me the second mate. Well, as the captain put his face over the rail, he gave a cry of astonishment.
"Mould, by gum! Mould! Tons of it! Oh, good Lord!"
As I heard him shout that, I scrambled the more eagerly after him, and in a moment or two I was able to see what he meant. Everywhere that the light from the 2 lamps struck, there was nothing but smooth, great masses and surfaces of a dirty white-coloured mould. I climbed over the rail, with the second mate close behind, and stood upon the mould-covered decks. Well, there might have been no planking beneath the mould, for all that our feet could feel. It gave way under our tread with a spongy, puddingy feel. It covered the deck furniture of the old ship so that the shape of each article and fitment was often no more than suggested through it. Captain Gannington snatched a lamp from the man, and the second mate reached for the other. They held the lamps high, and we all stared. It was most extraordinary, and somehow most abominable. I can think of no other word, gentlemen, that so much describes the predominant feeling that affected me at the moment.
"Good Lord,"
said Captain Gannington several times.
"Good Lord."
But neither the second mate nor the man said anything, and, for my part, I just stared, and at the same time began to smell a little at the air, for there was a vague odour of something half familiar that somehow brought to me a sense of half-known fright. I turned this way and that, staring, as I've said. Here and there the mould was so heavy as to entirely disguise what lay beneath, converting the deck fittings into indistinguishable mounds of mould, all dirty white and blotched and veined with irregular, dull, purplish markings. There was a strange thing about the mould, which Captain Gannington drew attention to. It was that our feet did not crush into it and break the surface, as might have been expected, but merely indented it.
"I never seen nothing like it before. Never,"
said the captain after having stooped with his lamp to examine the mould under our feet. He stamped with his heel, and the mould gave out a dull, puddingy sound. He stooped again, and with a quick movement, stared, holding the lamp close to the deck.
"Oh, blessed if it ain't a regular skin to it."
The second mate and the man and I all stooped and looked at it. The second mate prodded it with his forefinger, and I remember I rapped it several times with my knuckles, listening to the dead sound it gave out, and noticing the close, firm texture of the mould.
"Yo,"
the second mate said.
"Oh, it's just like blessed dough. Oof."
He stood up with a quick movement.
"Oh, I could fancy it stinks a bit,"
he said. As he said this, I knew, suddenly, what the familiar thing was in the vague odor that hung about us. It was that the smell had something animal-like in it. Something of the same smell, only heavier, that you would smell in any place that's infested with mice. I began to look about with a sudden, very real uneasiness. There might be vast numbers of hungry rats aboard. They might prove exceedingly dangerous if in a starving condition. Yet, as you will understand, somehow I hesitated to put forward my idea as a reason for caution. It was too fanciful. Captain Gannington had begun to go aft along the mould-covered main deck with the second mate, each of them holding their lamps high up so as to cast a good light about the vessel. I turned quickly and followed them, the man with me keeping close to my heels and plainly uneasy. As we went, I became aware that there was a feeling of moisture in the air, and I remembered the slight mist or smoke above the hulk, which had made Captain Gannington suggest spontaneous combustion in explanation. And, always as we went, there was that vague animal smell. Suddenly I found myself wishing we were well away from this old vessel. Abruptly, after a few paces, the captain stopped and pointed at a row of mould-hidden shapes on each side of the main deck.
"Guns,"
he said. "Been a privateer in the old days, I guess. Maybe worse.
Well, we'll have a look below, Doctor.
There may be something worth touching."
Well, she's older than I thought.
Mr. Salvin thinks she's about 200 years old,
but I scarce think it.
Well, we continued our way aft. I remember that I found myself walking as lightly and gingerly as possible, as if I were subconsciously afraid of treading through the rotten, mould-hid decks. I think the others had a touch of the same feeling from the way they were walking. Occasionally, the soft stuff would grip on our heels, releasing them with a little sullen suck. The captain forged somewhat ahead of the second mate, and I know that the suggestion he'd made himself that perhaps there might be something below worth carrying away had stimulated his imagination. The second mate was, however, beginning to feel somewhat the same way I did. At least, I have that impression. I think if it had not been for what I might truly describe as Captain Gannington's sturdy courage, we should all of us have just gone back over the side very soon, for there was most certainly an unwholesome feeling abroad that made one feel queerly lacking in pluck, and you'll soon see that this feeling was justified. Just as the captain reached the few mould-covered steps leading up onto the short half-poop, I was suddenly aware that the feeling of moisture in the air had grown very much more definite. It was perceptible now, intermittently, as a sort of thin, moist, fog-like vapor that came and went oddly, and seemed to make the decks a little indistinct to the view, this time and that. Once an odd puff of it beat up suddenly from somewhere and caught me in the face, carrying a queer, sickly heavy odor with it that somehow frightened me strangely with a suggestion of waiting and half-comprehended danger. We'd followed Captain Gannington up the 3 mould-covered steps, and now went slowly along the raised afterdeck. By the mizzenmast, Captain Gannington paused, and held his lantern near to it.
"My word, mister,"
he said to the second mate.
"It's fair thickened up with mould. Why, I'll guarantee it's close on 4 foot thick."
He shone the light down to where it met the deck.
"Oh, good Lord," he said. "Look at the sea lice on it."
They stepped up, and it was as he'd said. The sea lice were thick upon it, some of them huge, not less than the size of large beetles, and all a clear, colourless shade, like water, except there were little spots of grey on them.
"Oh, I've never seen the like of 'em, except on a live cod,"
said Captain Gannington in an extremely puzzled voice.
"My word, but they're whoppers."
Then he passed on, but a few paces farther aft he stopped again, and held his lamp near to the mould-hidden deck.
"Oh, Lord bless me, Doctor," he called out in a low voice. "Did you ever see the like of that? Why, it's a foot long if it's an inch."
I stooped over his shoulder and saw what he meant. It was a clear, colourless creature about a foot long and about 8 inches high, with a curved back that was extraordinarily narrow. As we stared, all in a group, it gave a queer little flick and was gone.
"Jumped," said the captain. "Well, if that ain't a giant of all the sea lice that I have ever seen. Oh, I guess it's jumped 20 foot clear."
He straightened his back and scratched his head a moment, swinging the lantern this way and that with the other hand and staring about us.
"What are they doing aboard here?" he said. "Oh, you'll see 'em. Little things. On fat cod and such like. I'm blowed, Doctor, if I understand."
He held his lamp towards a big mound of the mould that occupied part of the after portion of the lower poop deck, a little foreside of where there came a 2-foot-high break to a kind of second and loftier poop that ran aft to the taffrail. The mound was pretty big, several feet across, and more than a yard high. Captain Gannington walked up to it.
"I reckon this is the skull,"
he remarked, and gave it a heavy kick. The only result was a deep indentation to the huge whitish lump of mould, as if he'd driven his foot into a mass of some doughy substance. Yet I'm not altogether correct in saying that this was the only result, for a certain other thing happened. From the place made by the captain's foot there came a sudden gush of a purplish fluid, accompanied by a peculiar smell that was, and was not, half familiar. Some of the mould-like substance had stuck to the toe of the captain's boot, and from this likewise there issued a sweat, as it were, of the same colour.
"Well,"
said Captain Gannington in surprise, and drew back his foot to make another kick at the hump of mould. But he paused at an exclamation from the second mate.
"Oh, don't, sir,"
said the second mate. I glanced at him, and the light from Captain Gannington's lamp showed me that his face had a bewildered, half-frightened look, as if he were suddenly and unexpectedly half afraid of something, and as if his tongue had given way his sudden fright, without any intention on his part to speak. The captain also turned and stared at him.
"Why, mister?"
he asked in a somewhat puzzled voice, through which there sounded just the vaguest hint of annoyance.
"We've got to shift this mug if we're to get below."
I looked at the second mate, and it seemed to me that, curiously enough, he was listening less to the captain than to some other sound. Suddenly he said, in a queer voice,
"Listen, everybody."
And yet we heard nothing, beyond the faint murmur of the men talking together in the boat alongside.
I don't hear nothing,"
said Captain Gannington after a short pause.
"Do you, Doctor?"
"No," I said.
"What was it you thought you heard?"
the captain, turning again to the second mate. But the second mate shook his head in a curious, almost irritable way, as if the captain's question interrupted his listening. Captain Gannington stared a moment at him, then held his lantern up and glanced about him almost uneasily. Well, I know I felt a queer sense of strain, but the light showed nothing beyond the greyish, dirty white of the mould in all directions.
"Mr. Selvern,"
said the captain at last, looking at him,
"don't get fancying things. Get hold of your bloomin' self. You know you heard nothing."
"I'm quite sure I heard something, sir," said the second mate. "I seem to hear—" He broke off sharply and appeared to listen with an almost painful intensity.
"What did it sound like?" I asked. "It's all right, Doctor," said Captain Gannington, laughing gently. "You can give him a tonic when we get back. I'm going to shift this stuff."
He drew back and kicked for a second time at the ugly mass which he'd taken to hide the companionway. The result of his kick was startling, for the whole thing wobbled sloppily, like a mound of unhealthy-looking jelly. He drew his foot out of it quickly, took a step backward, staring and holding his lamp towards it.
"By gum,"
he said, and it was plain that he was generally startled.
"The blessed thing's gone soft."
Well, the man had run back several steps from the suddenly flaccid mound, and looking horribly frightened, though of what, I'm sure he had not the least idea. The second mate stood where he was and stared. For my part, I know I had a most hideous uneasiness upon me. The captain continued to hold his light towards the wobbling mound and stare.
"It's gone all squashy through," he said. "There's no scuttle there. There's no bally woodwork inside that lot. Oh, what a rum smell."
He walked round to the after side of the strange mound to see whether there might be some signs of an opening into the hull at the back of the great heap of mould stuff. And then,
"Listen,"
said the second mate again, in the strangest sort of voice. Captain Gallington straightened himself upright, and there succeeded a pause of the most intense quietness, in which there was not even the hum of talk from the men alongside in the boat. We all heard it, a kind of dull, soft thud, 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 somewhere in the hull under us, yet so vague as to make me half doubtful I'd heard it, only that the others did so too. Captain Gallington turned suddenly to where the man stood.
"Tell them,"
he began. But the fellow cried out something and pointed. There had come a strange intensity into his somewhat unemotional face, so the captain's glance followed his action instantly. I stared also, as you may think. It was the great mound at which the man was pointing, and I saw what he meant. From the two gapes made in the mould-like stuff by Captain Gallington's boots, the purple fluid was jetting out in a queerly regular fashion, almost as if it were being forced out by a pump. My word, but I stared, and even as I stared a larger jet squirted out and splashed as far as the man, spattering his boots and trouser legs. The fellow had been pretty nervous before, in a stolid, ignorant sort of way, and his funk had been growing steadily, but at this he simply let out a yell and turned about to run. He paused an instant, as if a sudden fear of the darkness that held the decks between him and the boat had taken him. He snatched at the second mate's lantern, tore it out of his hand, and plunged heavily away over the vile stretch of mould. Mr. Selvin, the second mate, said not a word. He was just staring at the strange-smelling twin streams of dull purple that were jetting out from the wobbling mound. Captain Gallington, however, roared an order to the man to come back, but the man plunged on and on across the mould, his feet seeming to be clogged by the stuff, as if it had suddenly grown soft. He zigzagged as he ran, the lantern swaying in wild circles as he wrenched his feet free with a constant plop, plop, and I could hear his frightened gasps even from where I stood.
"Come back with that lamp,"
roared the captain again, but the man still took no notice. And Captain Gallington was silent an instant, his lips working in a queer, inarticulate fashion, as if he were stunned momentarily by the very violence of his anger at the man's insubordination. And in the silence I heard the sounds again. Thud, 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 thud. Quite distinctly now, beating, it seemed suddenly to me, right down under my feet, but deep. I stared down at the mould on which I was standing, with a quick, disgusting sense of the terrible all about me. Then I looked at the captain, and tried to say something without appearing frightened. I saw that he had turned again to the mould, and all the anger had gone out of his face. He held out his lamp towards the mound, and was listening. There was another moment of absolute silence. At least, I knew that I was not conscious of any sound at all in the world, except for that extraordinary thud, 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 down somewhere in the huge bulk under us. The captain shifted his feet with a sudden, nervous movement, and as he lifted them, the mold went plop, plop. He looked quickly at me, trying to smile as if he were not thinking anything very much about it.
"What do you make of it, Doctor?"
he said.
I think...
I began, but the second mate interrupted with a single word, his voice pitched a little high, in a tone that made us both stare instantly at him.
"Look,"
he said, and pointed at the mound. The thing was all of a slow quiver. A strange ripple ran outward from it, along the deck, like you'd see a ripple run inshore out of a calm sea. It reached a mound a little foreside of us, which I'd supposed to be the cabin skylight. And in a moment the second mound sank nearly level with the surrounding decks, quivering floppily in a most extraordinary fashion. A sudden quick tremor took the mold right under the second mate, and he gave out a hoarse little cry and held his arms out on each side of him to keep his balance. The tremor in the mold spread, and Captain Gannington swayed and spread out his feet with a sudden curse of fright. The second mate jumped across to him and caught him by the wrist.
"The boat, sir,"
he said, saying the very thing that I'd lacked the pluck to say.
"For God's sake."
But he never finished, for a tremendous hoarse scream cut off his words. They hove themselves round and looked. I could see without turning. The man who'd run from us was standing in the waist of the ship, about a fathom from the starboard bulwarks. He was swaying from side to side and screaming in a dreadful fashion. He appeared to be trying to lift his feet, and the light from his swaying lantern showed an almost incredible sight. All about him the mold was in active movement. His feet had sunk out of sight. The stuff appeared to be lapping at his legs, and abruptly his bare flesh showed. The hideous stuff had rent his trouser leg away as if it were paper. He gave out a simply sickening scream, and, with a vast effort, wrenched one leg free. It was partly destroyed. The next instant, he pitched face downward, and the stuff heaped itself upon him, as if it were actually alive, with a dreadful, severe life. It was simply infernal. The man had gone from sight. Where he had fallen was now a writhing, elongated mound in constant and horrible increase, as the mold appeared to move towards it in strange ripples from all sides. Captain Gannington and the second mate were stone silent, in amazed and incredulous horror, but I had begun to reach towards a grotesque and terrific conclusion, both helped and hindered by my professional training. From the men in the boat alongside, there was loud shouting, and I saw two of their faces appear suddenly above the rail. They showed clearly a moment in the light from the lamp which the man had snatched from Mr. Salvin, for, strangely enough, this lamp was standing upright and unharmed on the deck, a little way foreside of that dreadful, elongated, growing mound that still swayed and writhed with an incredible horror. The lamp rose and fell on the passing ripples of the mold, just, for all the world, as you will see a boat rise and fall on little swells. It's of some interest to me now, psychologically, to remember how that rising and falling lantern brought home to me more than anything the incomprehensible, dreadful strangeness of it all. The men's faces disappeared with sudden yells, as if they'd slipped or been suddenly hurt, and there was a fresh uproar of shouting from the boat. The men were calling to us to come away, to come away. In the same instant, I felt my left boot drawn suddenly and forcibly downward, with a horrible, painful grip. I wrenched it free, with a yell of angry fear. Forward of us, I saw the vile surface was all a move, and abruptly I found myself shouting in a queer, frightened voice, "The boat, Captain! The boat, Captain!" Captain Gannington stared round at me, over his right shoulder in a peculiar dull way that told me he was utterly dazed with bewilderment and the incomprehensibleness of it all. I took a quick, clogged, nervous step towards him and gripped his arm and shook it fiercely. "The boat!" I shouted at him. "The boat! For God's sake, tell the men to bring the boat aft!" Then the mound must have drawn his feet down, for abruptly he bellowed fiercely with terror, his momentary apathy giving place to furious energy. His thick-set, vastly muscular body doubled and writhed with his enormous effort, and he struck out madly, dropping the lantern. He tore his feet free, something ripping as he did so. The reality and necessity of the situation had come upon him, brutishly real, and he was roaring to the men in the boat. "Bring the boat aft! Bring her aft! Bring her aft!" The second mate and I were shouting the same thing, madly. "For God's sake, be smart, lads!" roared the captain, and stooped quickly for his lamp, which still burned. His feet were gripped again, and he hove them out, blaspheming breathlessly and leaping a yard high with his effort. Then he made a run for the side, wrenching his feet free at each step. In the same instant, the second mate cried out something and grabbed at the captain. "It's got a hold of my feet! It's got a hold of my feet!" he screamed. His feet had disappeared up to his boot tops, and Captain Gannington caught him round the waist with his powerful left arm, gave a mighty heave, and the next instant had him free. But both his boot soles had gone. For my part, I jumped madly from foot to foot to avoid the plucking of the mould, and suddenly I made a run for the ship's side. But before I could get there, a queer gape came in the mould between us and the side, at least a couple of feet wide, and how deep I don't know. It closed up in an instant, and all the mould where the cape had been vent into a sort of flurry of horrible ripplings, so that I ran back from it, for I did not dare to put my foot upon it. Then the captain was shouting at me, "Aft, Doctor! Aft, Doctor! This way, Doctor! Run!" I saw then that he'd passed me and was up on the after-raised portion of the poop. He'd had the second mate thrown like a sack, all loose and quiet over his left shoulder, for Mr. Selvin had fainted, and his long legs flopped limp and helpless against the captain's massive knees as he ran. I saw with a queer, unconscious noting of minor details how the torn soles of the second mate's boots flapped and jigged as the captain staggered aft. "Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy!" shouted the captain, and then I was beside him, shouting also. The men were answering with loud yells of encouragement, and it was plain they were working desperately to force the boat aft through the thick scum about the ship. We reached the ancient, mould-hid taffrail and slewed about breathlessly in the half-darkness to see what was happening. Captain Gannington had left his lantern by the big mound when he picked up the second mate, and as we stood, gasping, we discovered suddenly that all the mould between us and the light was full of movement. Yet the part on which we stood, for about 6 or 8 feet forward of us, was still firm. Every couple of seconds we shouted to the men to hasten, and they kept on calling to us that they would be with us in an instant. And all the time we watched the deck of that dreadful hulk, feeling, for my part, literally sick with mad suspense, and ready to jump overboard into that filthy scum all about us. Down somewhere in the huge bulk of the ship, there was all the time that extraordinary dull, ponderous thud, 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 growing ever louder. I seemed to feel the whole hull of the derelict beginning to quiver and thrill with each dull beat. And to me, with the grotesque and hideous suspicion of what made that noise, it was at once the most dreadful and incredible sound I had ever heard. As we waited desperately for the boat, I scanned incessantly so much of the grey-white bulk as the lamp showed. The whole of the deck seemed to be in strange movement. Forward of the lamp, I could see indistinctly the moundings of the mould swaying and nodding hideously beyond the circle of the brightest rays. Nearer, and in full glow of the lamp, The mound, which should have indicated the skylight, was swelling steadily. There were ugly purple veinings on it, and as it swelled, it seemed to me that the veinings and mottlings on it were becoming plainer, rising as though embossed upon it, like you'll see the veins stand out on the body of a powerful, full-blooded horse. It was most extraordinary. The mound that we'd supposed to cover the companionway had sunk flat with the surrounding mould, and I could not see that it jetted out any more of the purplish fluid. A quaking movement of the mound began away forward of the lamp, and came flurrying away aft towards us, and at the sight of that I climbed up on the spongy-feeling taffrail and yelled afresh for the boat. The men answered with a shout, which told me they were nearer, but the beastly scum was so thick that it was evidently a fight to move the boat at all. Beside me, Captain Gannington was shaking the second mate furiously, and the man stirred and began to moan. The captain shook him again.
Wake up, mister,"
he shouted. The second mate staggered out of the captain's arms and collapsed suddenly, shrieking, "My feet! Oh, God, my feet!" The captain and I lugged him off the mound and got him into a sitting position upon the taffrail, where he kept up a continual moaning.
"Hold him, doctor,"
said the captain, and whilst I did so, he ran forward a few yards and peered down over the starboard quarter rail.
"Oh, for God's sake, be smart, lads, be smart,"
he shouted down to the men, and they answered him, breathless, from close at hand, yet still too far away for the boat to be any use to us on the instant. I was holding the moaning, half-unconscious officer and staring forward along the poop decks. The flurrying of the mould was coming aft, slowly and noiselessly, and then, suddenly, I saw something closer.
"Look out, Captain,"
I shouted, and, even as I shouted, the mould near to him gave a sudden, peculiar slobber. I'd seen a ripple stealing towards him through the mould. He gave an enormous, clumsy leap and landed near to us on the sound part of the mould, but the movement followed him. He turned and faced it, swearing fiercely. All about his feet there came abruptly little gapings, which made horrid sucking noises.
"Come back, Captain," I yelled. "Come back, quick!"
As I shouted, a ripple came at his feet, lipping at them, and he stamped insanely at it, and leaped back, his boot torn half off his foot. He swore madly with pain and anger, and jumped swiftly for the taffrail.
"Come on, doctor, over we go,"
he called. Then he remembered the filthy scum, and hesitated, and roared out desperately to the men to hurry. I stared down also.
"The second mate,"
I said.
"I'll take charge, doctor,"
said Captain Gannington, and caught hold of Mr. Selvin. As he spoke, I thought I saw something between us, outlined against the scum. I leaned out over the stern and peered. There was something under the port quarter.
"There's something down there, Captain,"
I called, and pointed in the darkness. He stooped far over and stared.
"A boat, by gum, a boat!"
he yelled, and began to wriggle swiftly along the taffrail, dragging the second mate after him. I followed.
"A boat it is, sure,"
he exclaimed a few moments later, and picking up the second mate clear of the rail, he hove him down into the boat, where he fell with a crash into the bottom.
"Over you go, doctor,"
he yelled at me, and pulled me bodily off the rail and dropped me after the officer. As he did so, I felt the whole of the ancient, spongy rail give a peculiar, sickening quiver and begin to wobble. I fell onto the second mate, and the captain came after, almost in the same instant, but, unfortunately, he landed clear of us onto the fore thwart, which broke under his weight with a loud crack and splintering of wood.
"Thank God,"
I heard him mutter.
"Thank God.
I guess that was a mighty near thing to go into Hades." He struck a match just as I got to my feet, and between us we got the second mate straightened out on one of the after fore and aft thwarts. We shouted to the men in the boat, telling them where we were, and saw the light of their lantern shining round the starboard counter of the Derelict. They called back to us to tell us they were doing their best, and then, whilst we waited, Captain Gannington struck another match, began to overhaul the boat we dropped into. She was a modern two-bowed boat, and on the stern there was printed Cyclone Glasgow. She was in pretty fair condition, and had evidently drifted into the scum and been held by it. Captain Gannington struck several matches, and went forward towards the Derelict. Suddenly, he called to me. I jumped over the thwarts to him. "Look, Doctor," he said, and I saw what he meant. A mass of bones up in the bows of the boat. I stooped over them and looked. There were the bones of at least 3 people, all mixed together in an extraordinary fashion, and quite clean and dry. I had a sudden thought concerning the bones, but I said nothing, for my thought was vague in some ways and concerned the grotesque and incredible suggestion that had come to me as to the cause of that ponderous, dull thud, 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 thud that beat on so infernally within the hull. It was plain to hear even now that we got off the vessel herself. And all the while, I had a sick, horrible mental picture of that frightful, wriggling mound aboard the Hulk. As Captain Gannington struck a final match, I saw something that sickened me, and the captain saw it in the same instant. The match went out, and he fumbled clumsily for another, and struck it. We saw the thing again. We had not been mistaken. A great lip of grey-white was protruding in over the edge of the boat. A great lappet of the mould was coming stealthily towards us, a live mass of the very hull itself. And suddenly Captain Gannington yelled out in so many words the grotesque and incredible thing I was thinking. "She's alive." I had never heard such a sound of comprehension and terror in a man's voice. The very horrified assurance of it made actual to me the thing that before had only lurked in my subconscious mind. I knew he was right. I knew that the explanation my reason and my training both repelled and reached towards was the true one. Oh, I wonder whether anyone can possibly understand our feelings in that moment. The unmitigated horror of it, and the incredibleness. As the light of the match burned up fully, I saw that the mass of living matter coming towards us was streaked and veined with purple, the veins standing out, enormously distended. The whole thing quivered continuously to each ponderous thud, 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 thud of that gargantuan organ that pulsed within the huge, great white bulk. The flame of the match reached the captain's fingers, and there came to me a little sickly whiff of burned flesh, but he seemed unconscious of any pain. Then the flame went out in a brief sizzle, yet at the last moment I'd seen an extraordinary raw look become visible upon the end of that monstrous protruding lappet. It had become dewed with a hideous purplish sweat, and with the darkness there came a sudden charnel-like stench. I heard the matchbox split in Captain Gannington's hands as he wrenched it open. Then he swore in a queer, frightened voice, for he had come to the end of his matches. He turned clumsily in the darkness and tumbled over the nearest thwart in his eagerness to get to the stern of the boat, and I after him. For we knew that thing was coming towards us through the darkness, reaching over that piteous mingled heap of human bones all jumbled together in the bows. We shouted madly to the men, and for answer saw the bows of the boat merge dimly into view round the starboard counter of the Derelict. "Oh, thank God!" I gasped out, but Captain Gannington roared to them to show a light. Yet this they could not do, for the lamp had just been stepped on in their desperate efforts to force the boat round to us. "Quick, quick!" I shouted. "For God's sake, be smart, men!" roared the captain. And both of us faced the darkness under the port counter, out of which we knew, but could not see, the thing was coming for us. "An oar! Smart! Now, pass me an oar!" shouted the captain, and reached out his hands through the gloom towards the oncoming boat. I saw a figure stand up in the bows and hold something out to us across the intervening yards of scum. Captain Gannington swept his hands through the darkness and encountered it. "I've got it. Let go there," he said in a quick, tense voice. In the same instant, the boat we were in was pressed over suddenly to starboard by some tremendous weight. Then I heard the captain shout, "Duck your head, Doctor." And directly afterwards, he swung the heavy 14-foot oar round his head and struck into the darkness. There came a sudden squelch, and he struck again with a savage grunt of fierce energy. At the second blow, the boat righted with a slow movement, and directly afterwards, the other boat bumped gently into ours. Captain Gannington dropped the oar, and, springing across to the second mate, hove him up off the thwart and pitched him with knee and arms clear in over the bows among the men. They shouted to me to follow, which I did, and he came after me, bringing the oar with him. We carried the second mate aft, and the captain shouted to the men to back the boat a little. Then he got her bows clear of the boat we'd just left, and so headed out through the scum for the open sea. "Where's Tom Harrison?" gasped one of the men in the midst of his exertions. He happened to be Tom Harrison's particular chum, and Captain Gannington answered him briefly enough. "Dead. Pull. Don't talk." Now, difficult as it had been to force the boat through the scum to our rescue, the difficulty to clear seemed tenfold. After some 5 minutes pulling, the boat seemed hardly to have moved a fathom, if so much, and quite dreadful fear took me afresh, which one of the panting men put suddenly into words. "He's got us," he gasped out. "Same as poor Tom." It was the man who'd inquired where Harrison was. "Shut your mouth and pull," roared the captain. And so another few minutes passed. Abruptly, it seemed to me that the dull, ponderous thud, 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 thud came more plainly through the dark, and I stared intently over the stern. I sickened a little, for I could almost swear that the dark mass of the monster was actually nearer, that it was coming nearer to us through the darkness. Captain Gannington must have had the same thought, for after a brief look into the darkness, he jumped forward and began to double-bank the stroke-oar. "Get forward under the oars, Doctor," he said to me rather breathlessly. "Get in the bows and see if you can't free the stuff a bit around the bows." I did as he told me, and a minute later I was in the bows of the boat, puddling the scum from side to side and trying to break up the viscid, clinging muck. A heavy, almost animal-like smell arose off of it, and all the air seemed full of the deadening, heavy smell. I shall never find words to tell anyone on earth the whole horror of it all, the threat that seemed to hang in the very air around us, and but a little astern, that incredible thing, coming, as I firmly believed, nearer, and scum holding us like half-melted glue. The minutes passed in a deadly, eternal fashion, and I kept staring back astern into the darkness, but never ceasing to puddle that filthy scum, striking at it and switching it from side to side until I sweated. Abruptly, Captain Gannington sang out, "We're gaining, lads. Pull!" And I felt the boat forge ahead perceptibly, as they gave way with renewed hope and energy. There was soon no doubt of it, for presently that hideous thud, 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 thud had grown quite dim and vague somewhere astern, and I could no longer see the derelict, for the night had come down tremendously dark, and all the sky was thick, overset with heavy clouds. As we drew nearer and nearer to the edge of the scum, the boat moved more and more perceptibly, until suddenly we emerged with a clean, sweet, fresh sound into the open sea. "Thank God," I said aloud, and drew in the boat hook, and made my way aft again to where Captain Gannington now sat once more at the tiller. I saw him looking anxiously up at the sky and across to where the lights of our vessel burned, and again he would seem to listen intently, so that I found myself listening also.
What's that, Captain?
I said sharply, for it seemed to me that I heard a sound far astern, something between a queer whine and a low whistling.
What is that?
It's wind, Doctor, he said in a low voice. I wish to God we were aboard. Then, to the men,
Pull. Put your backs into it, or you'll never put your teeth through good bread again.
The men obeyed nobly, and we reached the vessel safely, and had the boat safely stowed before the storm came, which it did in a furious white smother out of the west. I could see it for some minutes beforehand, tearing the sea in the gloom into a wall of phosphorescent foam, and as it came nearer, that peculiar whining, piping sound grew louder and louder, till it was like a vast steam whistle rushing towards us. And when it did come, we got it very heavy indeed, so that the morning showed us nothing but a welter of white seas, with that grim derelict many a score of miles away in the smother, lost as utterly as our hearts could wish to lose her. When I came to examine the second mate's feet, I found them in a very extraordinary condition. The soles of them had the appearance of having been partly digested. I know of no other word that so exactly describes their condition, and the agony the man suffered must have been dreadful.
Now,
concluded the doctor,
that is what I call a case in point. If we could know exactly what the old vessel had originally been loaded with, and the juxtaposition of the various articles of her cargo, plus the heat and the time she'd endured, plus one or two other only guessable quantities, we should have solved the chemistry of the life force, gentlemen. Not necessarily the origin, mind you, but at least we should have taken a big step on the way. I've often regretted that gale, you know. In a way, that is, in a way. It was a most amazing discovery, but at the same time I had nothing but thankfulness to be rid of it. A most amazing chance. I often think of the way the monster woke out of its torpor. Oh, and that scum. The dead pigs caught in it. Oh, I fancy that was a grim kind of a net, gentlemen. And it caught many things.
The old doctor sighed and nodded.
If I could have had a bill of lading, he said, his eyes full of regret. It might have told me something to help. But anyway.
He began to fill his pipe again.
I suppose,
he ended, looking round at us gravely,
I suppose we humans are an ungrateful lot of beggars at the best, but oh, what a chance. What a chance, eh?
The Hunters from Beyond by Clark Ashton Smith.
I've seldom been able to resist the allurement of a bookstore, particularly one that's well supplied with rare and exotic items. Therefore I turned in at Tolman's to browse around for a few minutes. I'd come to San Francisco for one of my brief biannual visits and had started early that idle forenoon to an appointment with Cyprian Sinkle, the sculptor, a second or third cousin of mine, whom I'd not seen for several years. The studio was only a block from Tolman's, and there seemed to be no especial object in reaching it ahead of time. Cyprian had offered to show me his collection of recent sculptures, but remembering the smooth mediocrity of his former work, amid which there were a few banal efforts to achieve horror and grotesquerie, I did not anticipate anything more than an hour or two of dismal boredom. The little shop was empty of customers. Knowing my proclivities, the owner and his one assistant became tacitly non-attentive after a word of recognition, and left me to rummage at will among the curiously laden shelves. Wedged in between other but less alluring titles, I found a luxury edition of Goya's Proverbs. I began to turn the heavy pages and was soon engrossed in the diabolic art of these nightmare-nurtured drawings. It had always been incomprehensible to me that I did not shriek aloud with mindless, overmastering terror when I happened to look up from the volume and saw the thing that was crouching in a corner of the bookshelves before me. I could not have been more hideously startled if some hellish conception of Goya had suddenly come to life and emerged from one of the pictures in the folio. What I saw was a forward-slouching, vermin-grey figure, wholly devoid of hair or down or bristles, but marked with faint, etiolated rings like those of a serpent that has lived in darkness. It possessed the head and brow of an anthropoid ape, a semi-canine mouth and jaw, and arms ending in twisted hands whose black hyena talons nearly scraped the floor. The thing was infinitely bestial, and at the same time macabre, for its parchment skin had shriveled, corpse-like, mummified in a manner impossible to convey, and from eye sockets well-nigh deep as those of a skull, there glimmered evil slits of yellowish phosphorescence, like burning sulphur. Fangs that were stained as if with poison or gangrene issued from the slavering, half-open mouth, and the whole attitude of the creature was that of some maleficent monster in readiness to spring. Though I had been for years a professional writer of stories that often dealt with occult phenomena, with the weird and the spectral, I was not at this time possessed of any clear and settled belief regarding such phenomena. I had never before seen anything that I could identify as a phantom, nor even an hallucination, and I should hardly have said offhand that a bookstore on a busy street in full summer daylight was the likeliest places to see one. But the thing before me was assuredly nothing that could ever exist among the permissible forms of a sane world. It was too horrific, too atrocious to be anything but a creation of unreality. Even as I stared across the Goya, sick with half-incredulous fear, the apparition moved toward me. Well, I say that it moved, but its change of position was so instantaneous, so utterly without effort or visible transition, that the verb is hopelessly inadequate. The foul spectre had seemed 5 or 6 feet away, but now it was stooping directly above the volume that I held in my hands, with its loathsomely lambent eyes peering upward at my face, and a grey-green slime drooling from its mouth on the broad pages. At the same time I breathed an insupportable fetor, like a mingling of rancid serpent stench with the mouldiness of antique charnels and the fearsome reek of newly decaying carrion. In a frozen timelessness that was perhaps no more than a second or two, my heart appeared to suspend its beating, while I beheld the ghastly face. Gasping, I let the Goya drop with a resonant bang on the floor, and even as it fell, I saw that the vision had vanished. Tolman, a tonsured gnome with shell-rimmed goggles, rushed forward to retrieve the fallen volume, exclaiming, "What is wrong, Mr. Hestane? Are you ill?" From the meticulousness with which he examined the binding in search of possible damage, I knew that his chief solicitude was concerning the Goya. It was plain that neither he nor his clerk had seen the phantom, nor could I detect aught in their manner to indicate that they had noticed the mephitic odour that still lingered in the air, like an exhalation from broken graves. And, as far as I could tell, they did not even perceive the greyish slime that still polluted the open folio. I do not remember how I managed to make my exit from the shop. My mind had become a seething blur of muddled horror, of crawling, sick revulsion from the supernatural vileness I had beheld, together with the direst apprehension for my own sanity and safety. I recall only that I found myself on the street above Tolman's, walking with feverish rapidity toward my cousin's studio, with a neat parcel containing the Goya volume under my arm. Evidently, in my effort to atone for my clumsiness, I must have bought and paid for the book by a sort of automatic impulse, without any real awareness of what I was doing. I came to the building in which was my destination, but went on around the block several times before entering. All the while I fought desperately to regain my self-control and equipoise. I remember how difficult it was to moderate the pace at which I was walking, or refrain from breaking into a run, for it seemed to me that I was fleeing all the time from an invisible pursuer. I tried to argue with myself to convince the rational part of my mind that the apparition had been the product of some evanescent trick of light and shade, or a temporary dimming of eyesight. But such sophistries were useless, for I'd seen the gargoylish terror all too distinctly, in an unforgettable fullness of grisly detail. What could the thing mean? I'd never used narcotic drugs or abused alcohol. My nerves, as far as I knew, were in sound condition. But either I'd suffered a visual hallucination that might mark the beginning of some obscure cerebral disorder, or had been visited by a spectral phenomenon, by something from the realms and dimensions that are past the normal scope of human perception. It was a problem either for the alienist or the occultist. Though I was still damnably upset, I contrived to regain a nominal composure of my faculties. Also, it occurred to me that the unimaginative portrait busts and tamely symbolic figure groups of Cyprian Sincoll might serve admirably to soothe my shaken nerves. Even his grotesques would seem sane and ordinary by comparison with the blasphemous gargoyle that had drooled before me in the bookshop. I entered the studio building and climbed a worn stairway to the second floor, where Cyprian had established himself in a somewhat capacious suite of rooms. As I went up the stairs, I had the peculiar feeling that somebody was climbing them just ahead of me, but I could neither see nor hear anyone, and the hall above was no less silent and empty than the stairs. Cyprian was in his atelier when I knocked. After an interval which seemed unduly long, I heard him call out, telling me to enter. I found him wiping his hands on an old cloth, and surmised that he'd been modelling. A sheet of light burlap had been thrown over what was plainly an ambitious but unfinished group of figures, which occupied the centre of the long room. All around were other sculptures in clay, bronze, marble, and even the terracotta and steatite which he sometimes employed for his less conventional conceptions. At one end of the room there stood a heavy Chinese screen. At a single glance I realized that a great change had occurred, both in Cyprian Sincoll and his work. I remembered him as an amiable, somewhat flabby-looking youth, always dapperly dressed with no trace of the dreamer or visionary. It was hard to recognize him now, for he had become lean, harsh, vehement, with an air of pride and penetration that was almost Luciferian. His unkempt mane of hair was already shot with white, and his eyes were electrically brilliant with a strange knowledge, and yet somehow they were vaguely furtive, as if there dwelt behind them a morbid and macabre fear. The change in his sculptures was no less striking. The respectable tameness and polished mediocrity were gone, and in their place, incredibly, was something little short of genius. More unbelievable still, in view of the laboriously ordinary grotesques of his earlier phase, was the trend that his art had now taken. All around me were frenetic, murderous demons, satyrs mad with nympholepsy, ghouls that seemed to sniff the odours of the charnel, lamias voluptuously coiled about their victims, and less nameable things that belonged to the outland realms of evil myth and malign superstition. Sin, horror, blasphemy, diablerie, the lust and malice of pandemonium, all had been caught with impeccable art. The potent nightmarishness of these creations was not calculated to reassure my trembling nerves, and all at once I felt an imperative desire to escape from the studio, to flee from the baleful throng of frozen cacodemons and chiseled chimeras. My expression must have betrayed my feelings to some extent. "Pretty strong work, aren't they?" said Cyprian in a loud, vibrant voice with a note of harsh pride and triumph. "I can see that you're surprised. You didn't look for anything of the sort, I dare say." "No, candidly I didn't," I admitted. "Good Lord, man, you will become the Michelangelo of diabolism if you go on at this rate. Where on earth do you get such stuff?" "Yes, I've gone pretty far," said Cyprian, seeming to disregard my question. "Further even than you think, probably. If you could know what I know, could see what I have seen, you might make something really worthwhile out of your weird fiction, Philip. You are very clever and imaginative, of course, but you've never had any experience." Well, I was startled and puzzled. "Experience? What do you mean?" "Precisely that. You try to depict the occult and the supernatural without even the most rudimentary first-hand knowledge of them. I tried to do something of the same sort in sculpture years ago, without knowledge, and doubtless you recall the mediocre mess that I made of it, but I've learned a thing or two since then." Sounds as if you made the traditional bond with the devil, or something of the sort, I observed with a feeble and perfunctory levity. Cyprian's eyes narrowed slightly, with a strange, secret look. I know what I know. Never mind how or what. The world in which we live isn't the only world, and some of the others lie closer at hand than you think. The boundaries of the seen and the unseen are sometimes interchangeable. Recalling the malevolent phantom, I felt a peculiar disquietude as I listened to his words. An hour before, his statement would have impressed me as mere theorizing, but now it assumed an ominous and terrifying significance. What makes you think I have no experience of the occult? I asked. Well, your stories hardly show anything of the kind, anything factual or personal. They are all palpably made up. When you've argued with a ghost, or watched the ghouls at mealtime, or fought with an incubus, or suckled a vampire, you may achieve some genuine characterization and color along such lines. Well, for reasons that should be fairly obvious, I had not intended to tell anyone of the unbelievable thing at Tolman's. Now, with a singular mixture of emotions, of compulsive, eerie terrors, and desire to refute the animadversions of Cyprian, I found myself describing the phantom. He listened with an inexpressive look, as if his thoughts were occupied with other matters than my story. Then, when I'd finished, You're becoming more psychic than I imagined. Was your apparition anything like one of these? With the last words, he lifted the sheet of burlap from the muffled group of figures beside which he'd been standing. I cried out involuntarily with the shock of that appalling revelation, and almost tottered as I stepped back. Before me, in a monstrous semicircle, were 7 creatures who might all have been modelled from the gargoyle that had confronted me across the folio of Goya drawings. Even in several that were still amorphous and incomplete, Cyprian had conveyed with a damnable art the peculiar mingling of primal bestiality and nurtury putrescence that had signalled the phantom. The 7 monsters had closed in on a cowering, naked girl, and were all clutching foully toward her with their hyena claws. The stark, frantic, insane terror on the face of the girl, and the slavering hunger of her assailants, were alike unbearable. The group was a masterpiece, in its consummate power of technique, but a masterpiece that inspired loathing rather than admiration. Following my recent experience, the sight of it affected me with indescribable alarm. It seemed to me that I'd gone astray from the normal, familiar world into a land of detestable mystery, of prodigious and unnatural menace. Held by an abhorrent fascination, it was hard for me to wrench my eyes away from the figure piece. At last, I turned from it to Cyprian himself. He was regarding me with a cryptic air, beneath which I suspected a covert gloating. "How do you like my little pets?" he inquired. "I'm going to call the composition The Hunters from Beyond." Before I could answer, a woman suddenly appeared from behind the Chinese screen. I saw that she was the model for the girl in the unfinished group. Evidently she'd been dressing, and she was now ready to leave, for she wore a tailored suit and a smart toque. She was beautiful, in a dark, semi-Latin fashion, but her mouth was sullen and reluctant, and her wide liquid eyes were wells of strange terror as she gazed at Cyprian, myself, and the uncovered statue piece. Cyprian did not introduce me. He and the girl talked together in low tones for a minute or two, and I was unable to overhear more than half of what they said. I gathered, however, that an appointment was being made for the next sitting. There was a pleading, frightened tone in the girl's voice, together with an almost maternal concern, and Cyprian seemed to be arguing with her or trying to reassure her about something. At last she went out, with a clear, supplicative glance at me, a glance whose meaning I could only surmise and could not wholly fathom. "That was Marta," said Cyprian. "She's half Irish, half Italian. Good model, but my new sculptures seem to be making her a little nervous." He laughed abruptly with a mirthless, jarring note that was like the cachinnation of a sorcerer. "Oh, in
God's name, what are you trying to do here? I burst out. What does it all mean? Do such abominations really exist on Earth or in any hell? He laughed once again, with an evil subtlety, and became evasive all at once. Anything may exist in a boundless universe with multiple dimensions. Anything may be real or unreal. Who knows? It's not for me to say. Figure it out for yourself if you can. There's a vast field for speculation, and perhaps more than speculation. With this, he began immediately to talk of other topics. Baffled, mystified, with a sorely troubled mind and nerves that were more unstrung than ever by the black enigma of it all, I ceased to question him. Simultaneously, my desire to leave the studio became almost overwhelming, a mindless, whirlwind panic that prompted me to run pell-mell from the room and down the stairs into the wholesome normality of the common 20th century streets. It seemed to me that the rays which fell through the skylight were not those of the sun, but of some darker orb, that the room was touched with unclean webs of shadow where shadow should not have been, that the stone satans, the bronze lamias, the terracotta satyrs, and the clay gargoyles had somehow increased in number, and might spring to malignant life at any instant. Hardly knowing what I said, I continued to converse for a while with Cyprian. Then, excusing myself on the score of a non-existent luncheon appointment, and promising vaguely to return for another visit before my departure to the city, I took my leave. I was surprised to find my cousin's model in the lower hall, at the foot of the stairway. From her manner and her first words, it was plain that she had been waiting. "You're Mr. Philip Hastane, aren't you?" she said in an eager, agitated voice. "I'm Martha Fitzgerald. Cyprian's often mentioned you, and I believe he admires you a lot." "Maybe you'll think I'm crazy," she went on, "but I had to speak to you. I can't stand the way that things are going here, and I'd refuse to come to the place anymore if it wasn't that I like Cyprian so much. I don't know what he's done, but he's altogether different from what he used to be. His new work is so horrible. You can't imagine how it frightens me. The sculptures he does are more hideous, more hellish all the time. Ugh, those drooling, dead-grey monsters in that new group of his. I can hardly bear to be in the studio with them. It isn't right for anyone to depict such things. Don't you think they're awful, Mr. Hastane? They look as if they broke loose from hell, make you think that hell can't be very far away. It is wrong and wicked for anyone to even imagine them, and I wish that Cyprian would stop. I'm afraid that something will happen to him, something terrible, to his mind if he goes on, and I'll go mad too if I have to see those monsters many more times. My God, no one could keep sane in that studio." She paused and appeared to hesitate. Then, "Can't you do something, Mr. Hastane? Can't you talk with him and tell him how wrong it is and how dangerous to his mental health? You must have a lot of influence with Cyprian. You are his cousin, aren't you? Oh, and he thinks you are very clever, too. Oh, I wouldn't ask you if I hadn't been forced to notice so many things that aren't as they should be. I wouldn't bother you either if I knew anyone else to ask. He shut himself up in that awful studio for the past year, and he hardly ever sees anybody. You're the first person he's invited to see his new sculptures. He wants them to be a complete surprise for the critics and the public when he holds his next exhibition. You'll speak to Cyprian, won't you, Mr. Hastane? I can't do anything to stop him. He seems to exult in the mad horrors he creates, and he merely laughs at me when I try to tell him the danger. However, I think that those things are making him a little nervous sometimes, that he's growing afraid of his own morbid imagination. Perhaps he'll listen to you." Well, if I'd needed anything more to unnerve me, the desperate pleading of the girl and her dark, obscurely baleful hintings wouldn't have been enough. I could see that she loved Cyprian, that she was frantically anxious concerning him, and hysterically afraid. Otherwise she would not have approached an utter stranger in this fashion. "But I haven't any influence with Cyprian," I protested, feeling a queer embarrassment. "And what am I to say to mine? His new sculptures are magnificent, and I've never seen anything more powerful of the kind.
And how could I advise him to stop doing them? There would be no legitimate reason. He would simply laugh me out of the studio. An artist has the right to choose his own subject matter, even if he takes it from the nether pits of Limbo and Erebus. Well, the girl must have pleaded and argued with me for many minutes in that deserted hall. Listening to her and trying to convince her of my inability to fulfill her request was like a dialogue in some futile and tedious nightmare. During the course of it, she told me a few details that I am unwilling to record in this narrative, details that were too morbid and too shocking for belief, regarding the mental alteration of Cyprian, and his new subject matter and method of work. There were direct and oblique hints of a growing perversion, but somehow it seemed that much more was being held back, that even in her most horrifying disclosures she was not wholly frank with me. At last, with some sort of hazy promise that I would speak to Cyprian, that I'd remonstrate with him, I succeeded in getting away from her and returned to my hotel. The afternoon and evening that followed were tinged as by the tyrannous adumbration of an ill dream. I felt that I'd stepped from the solid earth into a gulf of seething, menacing, madness-haunted shadow, and was lost henceforward to all rightful sense of location or direction. It was all too hideous and too doubtful and unreal. The change in Cyprian himself was no less bewildering, and hardly less horrifying than the vile phantom of the bookshop, and the demon sculptures that displayed a magisterial art. It was as if the man had become possessed by some satanic energy or entity. Everywhere that I went, I was powerless to shake off the feeling of an intangible pursuit, of a frightful, unseen vigilance. It seemed to me that the worm-grey face and sulphurous eyes would reappear at any moment, that the semi-canine mouth with its gangrene-dripping fangs might come to slaver above the restaurant table at which I ate, or upon the pillow of my bed. I did not dare reopen the purchased Goya volume, for fear of finding that certain pages were still defiled with a spectral slime. I went out and spent the evening in cafes, theatres, wherever people thronged and the lights were bright. It was after midnight when I finally ventured to brave the solitude of my hotel bedroom. Then there were the endless hours of nerve-wrung insomnia, of shivering, sweating apprehension beneath the electric bulb that I had left burning. Finally, a little before dawn, by no conscious transition and with no premonitory drowsiness, I fell asleep. I remember no dreams, only the vast incubus-like oppression that persisted even in the depth of slumber, as if to drag me down with its formless, ever-clinging weight into gulfs beyond the reach of created flight or the fathoming of organized entity. It was almost noon when I awoke. I found myself staring into the verminous, apish, mummy-dead face and hell-illumined eyes of the gargoyle that had crouched before me in the corner of torments. The thing was standing at the foot of my bed, and behind it, as I stared, the wall of the room, which was covered with a floral paper, dissolved in an infinite vista of greyness, teeming with ghoulish forms that emerged like monstrous misshapen bubbles from plains of ulgulant ooze and skies of serpentine vapour. It was another world, and my very sense of equilibrium was disturbed by an evil vertigo as I gazed. It seemed to me that my bed was heaving dizzily, was turning slowly, deliriously toward the gulf, that the feculent vista and the vile apparition were swimming beneath me, that I would fall toward them in another moment and be precipitated forever into that world of abysmal monstrosity and obscenity. In a start of profound alarm, I fought my vertigo, fought the sense that another world than mine was drawing me, that the unclean gargoyle was luring me by some unspeakable mesmeric spell, as a serpent is said to lure its prey. I seemed to read a nameless purpose in its yellow-slitted eyes, in the soundless moving of its oozy lips, and my very soul recoiled with nausea and revulsion as I breathed its pestilential fetor. Apparently, the mere effort of mental resistance was enough. The vista and the face receded. They went out in a swirl of daylight. I saw the design of tea roses on the wallpaper beyond, and the bed beneath me was sanely horizontal once more. I lay sweating with my terror, all adrift on a nightmare surmise of unearthly threat and whirlpool madness. till the ringing of the telephone bell recalled me automatically to the known world. I sprang to answer the call. It was Cyprian, though. I should hardly have recognized the dead, hopeless tones of his voice, from which the mad pride and self-assurance of the previous day had wholly vanished.
"I must see you at once," he said. "Can you come to the studio?"
I was about to refuse, to tell him that I'd been called home suddenly, that there was no time, that I must catch the noon train, anything to avert the ordeal of another visit to that place of mephitic hell, when I heard his voice again.
"Oh, you simply must come, Philip. I can't tell you about it over the phone. A dreadful thing has happened. Marta has disappeared."
I consented, telling him that I would start for the studio as soon as I dressed. The whole nightmare had closed in, had deepened immeasurably with his last words. But remembering the haunted face of the girl, her hysteric fears, her frantic plea, and my vague promise, I could not very well decline to go. I dressed and went out with my mind in a turmoil of abominable conjecture, of ghastly doubt, and apprehension all the more hideous because I was unsure of its subject. I tried to imagine what had happened, tried to piece together the frightful, evasive, half-admitted hints of an unknown terror into a tangible, coherent fabric, but found myself involved in a chaos of shadowy menace. I couldn't have eaten any breakfast, even if I'd taken the necessary time. I went at once to the studio and found Cyprian standing aimlessly amid his baleful statuary. His look was that of a man who'd been stunned by the blow of some crushing weapon, or has gazed on the very face of Medusa. He greeted me in a vacant manner, with dull, toneless words. Then, like a charged machine, as if his body rather than his mind was speaking, he began at once to pour forth the atrocious narrative.
"They took her," he said simply. "Maybe you didn't know it or weren't sure of it, but I've been doing all my new sculptures from life, even that last group. Marta was posing for me this forenoon, only an hour ago or less. I'd hoped to finish her part of the modeling today, and she wouldn't have had to come again for this particular piece. I hadn't called the things this time, since I knew she was beginning to fear them more and more. Oh, I think she feared them on my account more than her own. They were making me a little uneasy, too, by the boldness with which they sometimes lingered when I'd ordered them to leave, and the way they would sometimes appear when I didn't want them to. I was busy with some final touches on the girl figure, and wasn't even looking at Marta, when suddenly I knew the things were there. Well, the smell told me. If nothing else, I guess you know what that smell is like. I looked up and found the studio was full of them. They'd never before appeared in such numbers. Well, they were surrounding Marta, they were crowding and jostling each other, were all reaching toward her with their filthy talons. But even then, I didn't think they could harm her. Well, they are material beings in the sense that we are, and they really have no physical power outside their own plane. All that they do have is, well, a sort of snaky mesmerism. They'll always try to drag you down to their own dimension by means of it. God help anyone who yields to them, but you don't have to go unless you're weak or willing. I've never had any doubt of my power to resist them, and I didn't really dream they could do anything to Marta. It startled me, though, when I saw the whole crowd in Hellpack, and I ordered them to go pretty sharply. I was angry, and somewhat alarmed, too, but they merely grimaced and slavered with that slow, twisting movement of their lips that's like a voiceless gibbering, and then they closed in on Marta, just as I represented them doing in that accursed group of sculpture. Only there were scores of them now, instead of merely 7. I can't describe how it happened, but all at once their foul talons had reached the girl. They were pawing her, pulling at her hands, her arms, her body. She screamed, and I hope I'll never hear another scream so full of black agony and soul-unhinging fright. Then I knew that she'd yielded to them, either by choice or from excessive terror, and I knew that they were taking her away. For a moment, the studio wasn't there at all, only a long, grey, oozing plain, beneath skies that were the fumes of hell, writhing like a million ghostly and distorted dragons.
Marta was sinking into that ooze, and the things were all about her, gathering in fresh hundreds from every side, fighting each other for place, sinking with her like bloated, misshaped fang creatures into their native slime. And then, everything vanished, and I was standing here in the studio, all alone with these damn sculptures. He paused for a little, and then stared with dreary, desolate eyes at the floor. And then, it was awful, Philip, and I'll never forgive myself for having anything to do with those monsters. I must have been a little mad, but I've always had a strong ambition to create some real stuff in the field of the grotesque and visionary and macabre. I don't suppose you ever suspected, back in my stodgy phase, that I had a veritable appetence for such things. I wanted to do in sculpture what Poe and Lovecraft and Baudelaire have done in literature, what Robson and Goya did in pictorial art. And this was what led me into the occult. When I realized my limitations, I knew that I had to see the dwellers of the invisible worlds before I could depict them. I wanted to do it. I longed for this power of vision and representation more than anything else. And then, all at once, I found that I had the power of summoning the unseen. There was no magic involved, in the usual sense of the word. No spells and circles, no pentacles and burning gums from old sorcery books. At bottom, it was just willpower, I guess. A will to divine the satanic, to summon the innumerable malignites and grotesqueries of people from other planes than ours, or mingled unperceived with humanity. You have no idea what I've beheld, Philip. These statues of mine, these devils, vampires, lamias, satyrs, were all done from life, or at least from recent memory. The originals are what the occultists would call elementals, I suppose. There are endless worlds, contiguous to our own, or coexisting with it, that such beings inhabit. All the creations of myth and fantasy, all the familiar spirits that sorcerers have evoked, are resident in these worlds. And I made myself their master. I levied upon them at will. Then, from a dimension that must be a little lower than all others, a little nearer the ultimate nadir of hell, I called the innominate beings who pose for this new figure piece. I don't know who they are, but I have surmised a good deal. They are hateful as the worms of the pit. They are malevolent as harpies. They drool with a poisonous hunger not to be named or imagined. But I believe they were powerless to do anything outside their own sphere, and I've always laughed at them when they try to entice me, even though that snakish metal pull of theirs was rather creepy at times. It was as if soft, invisible, gelatinous arms were trying to drag you down from the firm shore into a bottomless bog. Oh, they are hunters, I am sure of that. Hunters from beyond. God knows what they'll do to Marta now they have her at their mercy. Oh, that vast, viscid, miasma-haunted place to which they took her is awful beyond the imagining of Satan. Perhaps even there they couldn't harm her body, but bodies aren't what they want. It isn't for human flesh that they grope with those ghoulish claws, and gape and slaver with those gangrenous mouths. The brain itself, and the soul, too, is their food. They are the creatures who prey on the minds of madmen and madwomen, who devour the disembodied spirits that have fallen from the cycles of incarnation, have gone down beyond the possibility of rebirth. Oh, to think of Marta in their power. It is worse than hell or madness. Marta loved me, I loved her too, though I didn't have the sense to realize it, wrapped as I was in my dark, baleful ambition and impious egotism. She was afraid for me, and I believe she surrendered voluntarily to the things. She must have thought they'd leave me alone if they secured another victim in my place. He ceased and began to pace idly and feverishly about. I saw that his hollow eyes were alight with torment, as if the mechanical telling of this horrible story had in some manner served to re-quicken his crushed mind. Utterly and starkly appalled by his hideous revelations, I could say nothing, but could only stand and watch his torture-twisted face. Incredibly, his expression changed, with a wild, startled look that was instantly transfigured into joy. Turning to follow his gaze, I saw that Marta was standing in the center of the room. She was nude, apart from a Spanish shawl that she must have worn while posing. Her face was bloodless as the marble of a tomb, and her eyes were wide and blank as if she'd been drained of all life, of all thought or emotion or memory, as if even the knowledge of horror had been taken away from her. It was the face of the living dead, and the soulless mask of ultimate idiocy, and the joy faded from Cyprian's eyes as he stepped toward her. He took her in his arms. He spoke to her with a desperate, loving tenderness, with cajoling and caressing words. She made no answer, however, no movement of recognition or awareness, but stared beyond him with her blank eyes, to which the daylight and the darkness, the void air and her lover's face, would henceforward be the same. He and I both knew, in that instant, that she would never again respond to any human voice, or to human love or terror, that she was like an empty cerement, retaining the outward form of that which the worms have eaten in their mausolean darkness, of the noisome pits wherein she'd been, of that bournless realm and its pullulating phantoms. She could tell us nothing. Her agony had ended with the terrible mercy of complete forgetfulness. Like one who confronts the Gorgon, I was frozen by her wide and sightless gaze. Then, behind her, where stood an array of carved Satans and Lamias, the room seemed to recede. The walls and floors dissolved into a seething, unfathomable gulf, amid whose pestilential vapors the statues were mingled in momentary and loathsome ambiguity with the ravening faces, the hunger-contorted forms that swirled toward us from their ultra-dimensional limbo, like a devil-laden hurricane from the Malabulge. Outlined against that boiling, measureless cauldron of malignant storm, Marta stood like an image of glacial death and silence in the arms of Cyprian. Then, once more, after a little, the abhorrent vision faded, leaving only the diabolic statuary. I like to think that I alone beheld it, that Cyprian had seen nothing but the dead face of Marta. He drew her close. He repeated his hopeless words of tenderness and cajolery, and then, suddenly, he released her with a vehement sob of despair. Turning away, while she stood and still looked on with unseeing eyes, he snatched a heavy sculptor's mallet from the table on which it was lying, and proceeded to smash with furious blows the newly modelled group of gargoyles, till nothing was left but the figure of the terror-maddened girl, crouching above a mass of cloddish fragments and formless, half-dried clay.
Well, my dear friends, I hope you enjoyed that old-school collection of stories in the wind and the rain and just freezing cold here today. Minus something, wind chill factor crazy. Oh, God, it's one of those days when you breathe in and you're like, there's ice going into my lungs. Your eyeballs actually feel cold from the oncoming wind. Oh, anyway, I suppose it's about right, isn't it? It is coming up to the end of December, so fair enough. So I hope that helped to keep you all warm on this beautiful Christmas Eve. So that's it. I will be back again. Well, I'm not going to stop until the end of the year, and lots more coming in 2026 as well. Okay, we've had the official opening of my channel. The first video that still remains was one from early January 2016, so planning something special for the other 10-year anniversary of this channel, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I am waffling on now. Till the next time, my dear friends, whatever you celebrate, whoever you're with, just have a lovely few days, yeah? I really am wishing you all the best. Till the next time, remember, these are just stories, and you sleep well, yeah? And happy Christmas.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, On Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.